Accelerated Learning. Learn faster through memorizing, multilingual education, and curiosity by Corey Hansen. Narrated by Mark Milroy. Chapter 1. Memorizing. If you need something now, it's great to have a backup kept in a second place. If you keep double vehicle keys or spare sunglasses in a drawer by the front door, and not just in your bag or jacket pocket, you are a lot more likely to have them rapidly when you need them. The exact same is very true for remembering things you really need to remember. If you want to remember something more easily, you can build that memory and store duplicates of the information in multiple places of your brain's storage system. Learning, examining, and practicing new information through multiple senses does just that. You achieve info storage in multiple brain areas and gain from faster memory construction and access to the information when you want it. Using several senses is a powerful and enjoyable way to build strong memory circuits in less time and keep the info secure in long-term memory. Here's how it works. Memory networks are constructed by brain activation. To turn information into memory, it must be assimilated into neural networks. That occurs by active processing, repeated activations, at the synapses. Each time the information or experience is come across, the repeated activations indicate the building and construction of increased, stronger connections amongst the nerve cells holding the memory. When new info first goes into, i.e., through things you hear, see, touch, picture, smell, taste, imagine, movements, and so forth, it is held in short-range memory for less than 1 minute. To transform into long-lasting memory, there must be the repeated activations of the short-lived memory circuit that, at first, has only weakly connected neurons. The repeated activation, use, of that circuit promotes what is called the neuroplastic response. That stimulation-activated neuroplasticity transforms the weakly connected short-range design templates into highly linked, effective, durable, and quickly retrievable long-term memory circuits. The more picks up, the better. Each type of sensory memory is stored in the lobe that gets the input from that specialized sensory system. Learning that is multisensory stimulates 2 or more memory systems in separate sensory brain storage areas. Visual memory is saved in the back of the brain, occipital lobes. Acoustic memory of what's heard is kept in the side regions, temporal lobes. Memories of touching experiences are saved to the left and right of center, parietal lobes. And movement memory in the lower posterior regions, such as the cerebellum. With several sensory inputs of the information, i.e., touching, seeing, moving, hearing, or picturing, and so on, multiple brain areas store info about the information being learned or ability being practiced. We see on neuroimaging how the several areas storing different sensory experiences of the exact same info connect to one another by interacting networks. Because each sense has a different storage area in the brain, multisensory memory is simpler to hook in, store, and remember. When one is triggered, that is, recall of what was seen, the others, what was heard, felt, visualized, are practically immediately co-activated. By recalling one of the ways the information was experienced, the other parts of the memory will come online and be available for recall. Multisensory memory power can be examined through the lens of neuroscience research. You may have heard people say that if one sense is lost, the others get stronger. That may or may not hold true for all senses, but here's an experiment wherein a part of the brain did get more powerful when a sense was lost. The visual reaction center in the brain, the occipital cortex, is generally only triggered by visual sensory information. Subjects were blindfolded for 5 days and did not get any visual or light input to their brains. At first, there was a big drop in activity in their visual response occipital cortexes. They did receive intense study and practice in reading by touch using Braille. After the 5 days of Braille practice, their visual occipital cortexes showed neural activity in new circuits that had been constructed and were rather comparable to those that are found in people who are blind from birth. By using their touch, increased their memory storage in both their sensory, touch, and visual response part of their brains. More senses means more storage. Each new sensory technique to the information builds more adjoining brain circuits. These brain cell networks are the highways that link numerous parts of the brain. Like traffic flow in a busy city, the more alternate paths there are to connect with a memory, the more effectively the traffic will flow, and the more rapidly and easily that memory will be retrieved when needed. When a sensory hit comes in to obtain a memory, the increased number of synaptic connections generates more powerful recall. Recalling one sensory cue will activate the others. This is an example. If you process information about how acoustic waves resolve reading and visioning and touching a vibrating thing, you'll have at least 3 brain storage boxes holding that knowledge. It does not matter which one enters your mind when you are trying to remember facts about sound waves. When you recall any one, like the feel of the vibrations, the related info about what you heard, read, or visualized will pop into your recall. Use it so you do not lose it. Use hearing, vision, and movement, or touch, to improve your memory of things you need to remember for tests, say in a presentation, or perform steps in a treatment. Here are some examples you can adjust for what you need to recall. Imagine. If you exaggerate the info in an excessive visualization, the extra emotional punch or humor will magnify the memory. Example: when subjects were shown video of hands touching different items, brain scans revealed activation not only of the visual cortex, but also of the neural regions in a remote region of the brain typically triggered when the brain directs the real touching. Tunes and rhymes improve memory. Just the way you found it easier to recall lyrics to a song than to memorize a poem, you'll increase memory storage when you put the information into a familiar tune or turn it into a rhyme. When gestures belong to that sound memory, the movements add a third storage locker for the info to further increase memory access. Hearing what you are reading. Next time there is something you need to read and remember, add the auditory sensory information by reading it quietly aloud. Your brain will now receive the information through the 2 sensory systems, vision and hearing. You are going to be more likely to recall what you read because of its duplicate parts of storage. Touch and movement. Movements add a multidimensional element to a memory and are specifically beneficial to recall ideas. An example is for students discovering planetary movement to physically revolve around a ball on the floor, mimicking a world revolving around the sun. Then they would add kipping down circles as they walk in their orbits, representing the rotation of the world on its turning point. Another good example of a multisensory learn and study experience is about the topic of electrical power. It helps students understand the idea of electrons and electricity when they do more than read about it. After checking out the relationship of electrons to the nucleus of an atom, they can visualize an electron orbiting the nucleus of an atom, imitate the buzz of electrical energy as it whizzes by, and feel the tingling related to the electron's negative charge by rubbing a balloon against their arms and feeling their arm hairs move. The several brain paths stimulated will carry the new information into several long-lasting memory banks for simple future withdrawal. So, make remembering and understanding much faster, more efficient, and more satisfying with multisensory processing. Memory building and construction will speed up, and you will have better access to retrieve the information for the test or task for which it was learned. An even greater reward is the boosted access to the info past the test or task to use for new applications, new problems, or creative developments. Fairly good rewards from making more powerful memories the multisensory way. Chapter 2. Why does running faster speed up learning in the cerebellum? Running to a faster speed improves learning in the cerebellum via mossy fibers. Faster treadmill running speeds boost associative learning in the cerebellum of mice, according to a new research study by scientists at the Champalimaud Center for the Unidentified. This paper, Locomotor Activity Regulates Associative Learning in Mouse Cerebellum, was released on April 16th in the journal Nature Neuroscience. The cerebellum is necessary for learning competent movements. It calibrates movements in the face of an altering environment to coordinate them in a really precise way, lead author Megan Carey said in a statement. Carey is the principal detective and group leader of the neuroscience program at the Champalimaud Center for the Unidentified in Lisbon, Portugal. The main takeaway from this study is that the faster mice ran on a treadmill, the faster and better their cerebellum learned an associative task called hold-up eye blink conditioning. The authors define the technique of their latest research. Here we investigated the impacts of behavioral state, and particularly locomotor activity, on delay eye blink conditioning, a cerebellum-dependent form of associative learning. In hold-up eye blink conditioning, animals learn to close their eye in response to an initially neuroconditioned stimulus that's reliably predictive of an aversive unconditioned stimulus, such as a puff of air to the eye. To gain a better grasp of the cellular changes that accompany learning in the cerebellum, Carey and coworkers developed a conditioned learning task of teaching mice to blink their eyes in response to a flash of light that was combined with a puff of air, while running towards numerous speeds on a treadmill. Eye blink conditioning is a typical way to check the speed and efficacy of associative learning in the cerebellum. The mice in this study who had their treadmills set at a faster speed learned to associate the flash of light, which generally does not cause mice to blink, with a puff of air more quickly. So, even if there was not a puff of air to accompany a flash of light, these mice immediately blinked. On the other side, it took much longer for delay eye blink conditioning to be encoded into the cerebellum of mice whose treadmills were set at slower speeds. In a declaration, the first author of this research study, Caterina Albagaria, summed up, "Our main finding was that we could make mice learn better by having them run faster." Notably, the researchers also found that subsequent eye blink performance benefited from much faster running speeds. The mice performed less well when we went a lot slower on the treadmill, and this occurred sometimes scales of several seconds, Albugaria said. After determining a causal link between running speeds and associative learning in the cerebellum, the researchers wanted to identify where this enhancement was taking place within the little brain. For this stage of their research study, the research group used optogenetics to stimulate particular nerve cells that predict to the cerebellum called mossy fibers. Within the cerebellum, sensory information is passed on from mossy fibers to granule cells in a way that allows a single mossy fiber axon to affect a huge number of Purkinje cells. Remarkably, when the scientists stimulated the mossy fibers using optogenetics, they observed improved learning on par with faster running speeds. Because of that, the researchers hypothesize that finding ways to straight boost the mossy fiber activity may have the same advantages on associative learning as running. It doesn't always really need to be mobility. Anything that drives a boost in mossy fiber activity could provide a comparable modulation of learning, Albugaria said. Regardless of these groundbreaking findings about associative learning in the cerebellum, the authors are really fast to explain that faster running speeds might not always boost learning speeds in other brain regions. We don't know whether this is very true for other non-cerebellar types of learning, Albugaria warns. Do faster running speeds enhance learning in the human cerebellum? According to Albugaria, the cerebellum is a well-conserved structure across species, and there are circuits that are pretty common across species. She hypothesizes that future research based upon these findings could help us better understand how locomotion affects associative learning in the human cerebellum. We tend to assume that to control the plasticity of the brain, so that people learn faster and sluggish learners enhance, we have to use drugs. But here, all we needed to do was to control how fast mice were going to get an improvement. It would be interesting to see if this holds for people, for cerebellar forms of learning, and even for other types of learning, Carey said in a statement. The authors conclude, "Our results suggest that locomotor activity regulates hold-up eye blink conditioning through increased activation of the mossy fiber pathway within the cerebellum. Taken together, these results offer proof for a unique role for behavior state modulation in associative learning and suggest a possible mechanism through which appealing in movement can enhance an individual's capability to learn." Future research in the Carey lab will try to answer bigger questions, like why walking and other kinds of aerobic exercise appear to help us collaborate thoughts, organize ideas, and think of creative solutions. Anecdotal evidence also links exercise with the aha moment. For example, Albert Einstein famously said of E equals mc squared, "I thought about that while riding my bike." Along this exact same line, Manish Sagar of Stanford University has found fMRI brain imaging evidence that improved cerebellum connectivity enhances creative capability. Chapter 3. How to Learn Faster. Over 40 years of mental research on learning and memory have given us 4 reliable concepts for facilitating learning. In a recent research study, scientists found that bringing 3 of these concepts into the classroom strongly affected student learning of complex engineering material. According to the study's co-author, Dr. Richard Baranek, The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Actually, they had a bigger influence, typically enhancement, than revamping curricula or teaching methods. So what are these three concepts? They are repeated practice at retrieving info, spacing learning sessions, and getting instant feedback. Here is how these principles were tested. Students registered in an upper-level Signals and Systems Engineering course at Rice University, went to lectures, and did homework assignments. However, they were also given follow-up issues to solve, spaced over 3 weeks of lectures. They were given immediate feedback on the follow-up problems. They were required to see the feedback to get credit for the assignment. This was done just because people are well known for skipping feedback information, which, ironically, is the single biggest source of information that is effective enough to improve their performance. The scientists also divided the class into 2 groups. In any normal week, half of the students were given the additional follow-up issues to solve, while the other half were not. Spacing the issues made students obtain information from past lectures, and this is what packs the punch in long-lasting learning. If you are only thinking about recalling material for a test the next day, and you are sure what material you are going to be tested on, it is possible to get away with simply cramming for the test. This type of learning is called massed practice. The problem with this method is that you'll forget the majority of the material in brief order. For sturdy learning, discovering you can rely on, distributed practice is far more remarkable. You simply space out your sessions over a certain time period and ensure that your sessions involve remembering what you learned before. The act of recovering previously learned material, when spaced out in this way, strongly impacts test performance. The results were clear: a 7% enhancement in test performance on material for which the students had done spaced follow-up problems. If that doesn't seem like much, note that this meant accomplishing a rating of 76% on multiple-choice questions compared to 69%, that is, attaining a C instead of a D in the course. To get the most out of your learning or teaching sessions, add this 4th solidly investigated principle into the mix. The quickest way to learn or teach something new is to show how it is comparable to something you or your students already know. The more complex the material, the more crucial it is to use analogies that touch base with principles you already understand. The hitch here is that analogies can be so effective that they can misinform. Remember learning that an atom is like the solar system? The electrons revolve around the nucleus like the world's focus on the sun? What prevents you from inferring that the nucleus is hot like the sun? The answer? Nothing, aside from judicious feedback that tells you which features from the solar system analogy should be imported into your new knowledge of atoms and which should not be imported. Chapter 4. Being Curious. The ability to learn faster than others is a competitive benefit. To thrive in an unsure and complex world doesn't depend upon the skills your group has, but on those they can acquire. Learning is a force for change. Having said that, how can your workers develop a discovering mindset? The actual answer is both simple and intricate. Companies must recuperate the power of curiosity. Easy because interest is something wired into our DNA. Complicated simply because our learning technique is broken. We keep teaching kids to think like machines and devices to think like grown-ups. For years, researchers have been trying to reproduce the wrong mind, that of an adult. Teaching devices to beat a chess master is easy, but devices can't think like a 4-year-old. The father of computer science and AI was onto something back in the 1950s. Instead of attempting to produce a program to replicate the adult mind, why not rather try to produce one which mimics the child's? Alan Turing. It took us 60 years to finally bring computer system researchers and developing psychologists together to analyze the formula of interest. The secret to learning lies in kindergarten, not in the adult brain. Interest is the mother of learning. We are all born curious. However, we stop checking out, learning, and discovering as we grow up. Thank the education system for making us susceptible to automation. Schools prepare children to pass a test rather than supporting a finding-out mind. We treasure understanding, not the experience of learning. As Andreas Schleicher said, the sorts of things that are easy to teach and perhaps easy to test are specifically the sorts of things that are easy to digitize and to automate. The German data researcher is on a mission to change how we teach kids. He really believes that we're getting ready for the future of work all wrong. We must stop teaching kids to think like robots. It's easy to learn and test mathematics. Robots are quite good at it, too. Nevertheless, younger children can imagine, create, question, and collaborate in ways that machines cannot yet. Sanjay Sarma, VP for Open Learning at MIT, thinks that our learning technique is dated. We inform people the exact same way we trained workers to use machines in the Industrial Revolution. The most crucial thing in learning is curiosity. We really need to build the habit of continuous learning. And, most importantly, better learning. Learning needs to become the new rocket science. Sanjay Sarma, MIT. The future of education needs shifting the focus from content-oriented scholastic tests to measuring adaptive abilities, attitudes, and competencies, consisting of empathy and creativeness. Schleicher believes that to change what we treasure, we must initially change what we measure. In recent years, schools and international tests, like PISA, are focusing more on problem-solving, cooperation, and international proficiencies like receptivity and self-awareness. The future looks appealing. There's an increased focus to develop creativity and curiosity. Kids' brains hold the secret to learning. 4-year-olds can learn things even the most smart machines can't. Empathy, for starters. In one study, 1-year-old children entered the laboratory and existed with 2 bowls, one with broccoli and one with goldfish crackers. The scientists tried both foods. They showed dislike for the goldfish and appreciation for the broccoli. When they asked the kids to hand them some candy, the children passed the broccoli, although they chose the crackers themselves. The outcome of the same experiment conducted with grown-ups was surprisingly different. Grown-ups always passed the goldfish. They presumed everybody likes them. As Alison Gopnik, the author of the research study, explains, children are more susceptible to comprehend other individuals. Adults tend to behave on autopilot. Younger children pay more attention because they wonder. Empathy, versatility, and generalization are something human 1-year-olds can do, but AIs can't. The brain of a child is continually stimulated and challenged. Interest produces dopamine, triggering the learning that takes place. Develop a learning state of mind. Unlike grown-ups, kids' learning process is driven by curiosity. Everything your company needs to know about learning, you can borrow from kindergartners. 1. Play to learn, learn to play. There's a critical connection between students' wellness, sense of belonging, and their academic achievement. For young kids, learning isn't connected to any benefit, like acing a test. Interest is a way of life. Playing and learning are two sides of the exact same coin. It's not a burden imposed by others, but an innate desire. If you feel good, you learn better. Organizations must highlight the development of social skills instead of promoting high achievement. Increased self-awareness, creativeness, cooperation, and communication are important to developing a learning frame of mind. 2. Learning makes time go slower. Time appears to accelerate as we grow older, though it slows down when we deal with new experiences or visit new spots. The more information our minds process, the slower time seems to pass. That is among the laws of psychological time, as Bob Clagett describes in his book, Making Time. Our perception of time is caused by the relationship between our experience of time and the amount of info our minds take in. The world is a remarkable place, filled with new perceptions, experiences, and ideas. Children know this. That's why they wonder. When you are busy exploring the world, time slows down. 3. Learning requires emptying your mind. When I ask an adult in one of my workshops to draw, they get immobilized. I don't know how to draw. When I ask a child, they immediately start drawing. It's not that children know how to draw. They do not think in right or wrong terms. Interest keeps our mind thirsty for more experiences. To learn something new requires emptying your mind. What you know is a challenge for incorporating new ideas. The mind can't hold attention for more than 10 minutes. Your short-range memory gets filled rapidly. Neuroscientists recommend taking routine breaks. The brain needs to develop necessary connections to recall information. 4. Active learning happens in the real world. New circumstances expand our consciousness. Being in an office restricts our curiosity. In the well-known Marshmallow Challenge experiment, kindergartners built taller towers than business school students. The reason? They plan and develop at the exact same time. Adults design initially and, only then, start touching the materials. Psychologists call it active learning, the capability to go out into the world and experiment. Rather than taking information someone else presents, children learn much more from direct interaction. Kids don't observe the world, they experience it. By experimenting, seeing, touching, playing, they get information to solve their issues. 5. Social learning, the power of cooperation. We learn faster and better, dealing with besides on our own. Kids are social learners. They do not learn in seclusion. They are continuously interacting with other children, instructors, and parents or caretakers. As Alison Gopnik clarifies here, children use theory of mind to choose whether and how to learn from others. They try to comprehend what's going on in other people's minds. Young children observe other people's conduct and try to infer if people are trying to teach them to perform a specific task or not. Machines are not yet there in comprehending standard theory of mind, not to mention using those reasonings. Curiosity is the most critical meta-skill to thrive in a fast-changing world. Your organization's success depends on relearning how to learn. The secret depends on kindergarten. Rather than attempting to get kids to think like adults, train your team to think more like kids. Chapter 5. Multilingual Brains. Better attention and cognition in children who grow up in bilingual settings have come to scientists' attention. A gift moms and dads can give children that money can't buy. Current studies of kids who grow up in multilingual settings expose benefits over single-language kids, including but not limited to both increased mindful focus and cognition. The findings correlate with prefrontal cortex brain activity networks, which direct the highest levels of thinking and awareness. Compared to monolinguals, the studied multilingual children, who had had 5 to 10 years of multilingual exposure, balanced higher scores in cognitive performance on tests and had greater attention focus, diversion resistance, decision-making, judgment, and responsiveness to feedback. The correlated neuroimaging, fMRI scans, of these children revealed greater activity in the prefrontal cortex networks directing these and other executive functions. This increased executive function activation in the brains of kids in multilingual settings extends beyond the translation of language consumption and output. The powerful implications of the new research are about brain power improved by growing up multilingual. The brain's CEO is a late bloomer. The networks that appear more active in the brains of multilingual kids belong to the brain's CEO networks, called executive functions. These are a constellation of cognitive abilities that support goal-oriented behavior, including directing attentive focus, focusing on, planning, self-monitoring, repressive control, judgment, working memory, upkeep and control of info, and analysis. It is not throughout the first months or even years of life that the brain undergoes its biggest changes with regard to cognition. Those neural networks of executive functions are the last areas of the brain to grow, as acknowledged by the pruning of unused circuits and the myelination of the most active networks as they become stronger and more effective. Executive functions like selective mindful focus and the capability to shut out diversion are normally minimally developed in youth. Those functions slowly become more powerful throughout the years of prefrontal cortex maturation into the mid-20s. It's with regard to these executive functions that research about the bilingual brain is particularly amazing. What is happening in the brains in bilingual settings? This aspect of multilingual research has focused on bilingual upbringing with one language spoken at home that is not the same as the dominant language of the nation. The interpretations of researchers, like Ellen Bialystok, who compared responses of 6-year-olds from multilingual and monolingual houses, suggest the bilingual brain is highly participated in the cognitive difficulty of assessing between the two competing language systems. That needs executive function attention selecting and concentrating on the language being used while deliberately hindering the activity of the contending language system. When bilingual brains examine language, control and storage networks of both their languages are active and available. This continuous processing that appears instant is not reflexive or unconscious. It needs deliberate focus of attention on particular input and withholding of focus from synchronized, distracting input to evaluate the language being used. Their brains really need to assess and identify not only the meaning of words, but also which patterns of syntax and grammar to use, and recognize subtleties of pronunciation special to the language of focus. Bialystok defines this massive activity as working out the executive functions early in bilinguals at work to decipher these multiple codes within each language. These control networks make choices, like which memory storage circuits are the language correct ones to activate from which to pick the right word, syntax, and pronunciation. The choices are demanding of a CEO that can simultaneously direct where continuous new input is sent out for effective examination and activate the correct language storage banks to use for response. Those executive functions, at the same time, coordinate the assessment of the content of the messages and direct the reaction to that info. Ramifications for Better begins. This inbound research supports encouraging parents to keep usage of their native language in the home, but too often, public opinions and misconceptions typically restrict kids taking advantage of the bilingual brain booster. One issue is parents' concern that direct exposure to one language is less confusing for kids. When I taught 5th grade in a school where most of the students' primary language was Spanish, I remember recently immigrated parents of my students telling me that though they were just learning English, they tried to only speak English at home with their children. They felt that would help their kids learn English more effectively, and believed that exposure to 2 languages would be complicated and make the transition to their new schools harder. Another issue limiting the multilingual experiences was children's desire to fit in. As my students' English fluency enhanced, they would sometimes be asked by their parents to translate from English to Spanish throughout school conferences. When they did so, such as throughout back-to-school night, many were plainly ashamed that their parents didn't speak English and even tried to keep away from having schoolmates hear them speak Spanish to their parents. When I would inquire about their hesitation, some would tell me that it made their parents appear oblivious when they did not speak English. My prompting of parents to support the multilingual experience by speaking Spanish with their kids in the home was hence withstood as children started to develop this predisposition against their native language. The other inference is to lay to rest the incorrect presumption that the brain has constraints that are overwhelmed with battle language direct exposure. The more we learn about neuroplasticity, the more it appears the reverse is really true. Experiences with new domains of obstacle in general seem to reinforce the brain's executive functions and cognition. This appears on neuroimaging and in performance on the cognitive testing, reading understanding, and success learning subsequent new languages. New challenges that include the application of judgment, analysis, reduction, translation, focusing on, attention focusing, repressive control, postponed gratification, and pursuit of long-term goals are related to understanding the number, strength, and efficiency of the executive function networks. Like our muscles become stronger with physical exercises, the developing brains of kids in bilingual environments appear to build strength, speed, and efficiency in their executive function networks. That is, the neurons that fire together, wire together phenomenon, that in reaction to the electrical activations of messages traveling through them when used, executive function networks develop stronger connections, dendrites, synapses, and myelinated axons. In the meantime, it appears that when families have another language that can be spoken in the home where kids are being raised, it could be a chance to improve their language skills and also supply a cognitive boost for their greatest brain networks of executive functions. The ramifications of the multilingual research raise factors to consider of what other early exposures, before and during academic years, can be created to promote these executive function activations in all children. What are the implications relating to introducing second languages to kids from monolingual homes? Perhaps grandparents, nannies, friendships with families who speak another language could hang around with the children, or parents could participate in parent-child language classes appropriate for children, like learning and singing tunes with movements in another language. Does the bilingual benefit on cognition also work on older kids and grown-ups who learn second languages to the point of fluency? Chapter 6. Cognitive Benefits of Second Language Immersion Education. The linguistic and academic success of second language immersion education is now well developed. What has been less clear until just recently was whether kids who go to immersion programs show the exact same kind of benefits in cognitive abilities like metalinguistic consciousness and executive control as do children who are early bilinguals. Metalinguistic awareness is our specific knowledge of different aspects of language, noises, words, syntax, and so on, and, when needed, our capacity to speak about these properties. It is essential in the development of literacy, for example. As for executive control, also referred to as executive function, it is a set of complex cognitive procedures that include attention, inhibition, monitoring, selection, planning, etc. Repressive control, working memory, and cognitive versatility are three core elements of executive control. In a current study, York University professor Ellen Bialystok and her associates Kathleen F. Peets and Sylvain Moreno studied the development of metalinguistic consciousness in children being multilingual in an immersion education program. They gave different tasks to 2nd and 5th grade English-speaking students in a French immersion program and compared their results with those of children in a routine English program. The jobs included morphological consciousness, including right morphological forms to nonsense words, syntactic awareness, making grammaticality judgments, and verbal fluency, creating words that come from a semantic classification or that start with a preliminary letter. Those three tasks varied in their need for executive control, from the least in the first job to the most in the third task. The researchers found that the metalinguistic advantages reported in studies of early bilinguals emerged slowly in these immersion children, with jobs needing less executive control giving positive results faster than tasks requiring more executive control. Hence, all immersion children exceeded their monolingual equivalents in the morphological consciousness jobs, even after 2 years of immersion, and 5th grade immersion program kids were more precise in the syntactic awareness tasks than their monolingual counterparts. The verbal fluency jobs started as an issue for the younger kids in the immersion program. Literacy guideline in English only begins in 3rd grade. but the older children had regained the ground and performed equivalently to monolingual children. The authors concluded that the benefits previously reported for early multilingual children could already be identified in kids learning another language in an immersion program. What about the advantages in executive control as such that children brought up bilingually show systematically over their monolingual equivalents? Do immersion kids also show these advantages? Belgian scientists Anne-Catherine Nicolet and Martine Poncelet analyzed this. They tested third-grade French-speaking children in an English immersion program and compared them to a comparable group following a monolingual curriculum. They examined attentional and executive skills by means of 6 different jobs like signaling, auditory selective attention, split attention, mental versatility, and so on. The results they found revealed that in 4 of the 6 jobs, the immersion kids did better than their monolingual equivalents. That is rather impressive, as the children had only had 3 years of immersion education, which involves less extensive direct exposure to a second language than in early bilingualism. And yet, the immersion experience had already produced some of the cognitive benefits related to early bilingualism. The one negative finding that surprised the researchers, that is, no distinction between the 2 groups, concerned interference inhibition. In the task they used, the flanker job, kids were presented with a main arrow pointing to the left or to the right, and flanker arrows above or right below pointing in the exact same direction or in the opposite direction. In this latter case, the flanker arrows develop a disturbance that has to be hindered to answer correctly. Kids needed to concentrate on the central arrow and press a left button when the main arrow pointed to the left and a right button for the arrow pointing to the right. The authors clarified the absence of a real difference between the 2 groups by the fact that young emerging bilinguals in immersion programs, 3rd-grade kids here, haven't yet had much practice at inhibiting disturbance since they devote less time to second language production in a classroom situation than in reality. Do children who have had further experience of immersion education show better control of interference inhibition? The answer comes from a paper by Ellen Bialystok and Raluca Barak, who also used a flanker test, but this time in 2 different research studies with immersion kids. In the first, they tested 2nd and 3rd graders who attended school in Hebrew, and in the second, they tested 2nd and 5th graders in a French immersion program. In both studies, they found that executive control efficiency enhanced with increased experience in a bilingual education environment. Essentially, the length of time spent in an immersion program. Some of their kids had had 2 more years of immersion than in the Belgian study, figures out the extent to which executive control is affected. So the news is outstanding for all those that are putting energy and time in immersion education, teachers and staff, parents or caretakers, and, naturally, kids. As Ellen Bialystok, Kathleen F. Peets, and Sylvain Moreno state so nicely, the road to bilingualism is incremental, and so are the accrued benefits. Chapter 7. The 10 Questions on Bilingualism. When a recent research study exposed that early exposure to several languages promotes the development of efficient communication abilities, it added to the recognized list of bilingualism advantages, that is, improved executive control, working memory development, delayed beginning of cognitive decline. Besides different cognitive and social advantages, the knowledge of foreign languages can bring along some noteworthy chances. At the start of our language learning journeys, for example, there is the adventure of hearing the new words in our own voices, the rush of cruising through streams of sentences that only a few months ago were impenetrable. After this, there is the possibility of discovering a shortcut to the heart of the societies we are checking out. Sometimes it's the mere benefit of finding just the right word to reveal some feeling or order a beer. And then other times, it is the invite to look at the world and at ourselves in a new light. According to some estimates, over half of the world's population is bilingual. Yet, fascinations with the ability to speak multiple languages continue amongst researchers and language students alike. When are you considered a bilingual? Bilinguals are those who use 2 or more languages or dialects in their everyday lives. For too long, bilinguals were mistakenly seen as those who are equally and totally proficient in their languages. This is extremely rarely the case, and this more reasonable definition of bilingualism has permitted many people who live with 2 or more languages to accept who they are, multilingual, rather simply. Are there distinctions in the brains of bilinguals and monolinguals? Recently, a leading researcher in the field, Dr. Ping Li of Pennsylvania State University, argued convincingly that there's no monolingual cortex or bilingual cortex, but rather that the brain uses the exact same neural structures and resources to deal with the multilingual's languages, but in different ways. Can adults learn to speak a foreign language without an accent? Scientists do not agree on an age limitation distinguishing between not having an accent in a second language and having one, but it is generally given at around 10 or 12, even 15 years of age. There are reports of highly inspired people, such as language instructors, who have learned a language later in life, but compensated for that downside with extensive contact with native speakers, extended stays in the country in question, the study of phonetics and pronunciation, and so on, and thus who can pass as native speakers of the language. Is it possible to be similarly proficient in Language 1 and Language 2? Most bilinguals use their languages for different purposes, in different circumstances, with different people. For this reason, they just do not really need to be similarly skilled in all their languages. The level of fluency they attain in a language, more specifically in a language ability, will depend on their need for that language and will be domain-specific. I have called this the complementarity concept. It's exceptionally uncommon that bilinguals have equal efficiency in their languages. Should parents or caretakers be wary of their multilingual children blending languages, i.e., should Language 1, Language 2 code switching within sentences be prevented? The intermingling of languages in children is regular, especially if the parents or caretakers are themselves bilingual and intermingle their languages also. Code switching and borrowing in kids is not an important factor in how well they will get and maintain 2 or more languages. Much more important problems are when the languages are acquired, which bilingual method the parents use, whether children have a very real need for each language, what type and amount of input is used for each language, and what other linguistic support parents can rely on. Do bilinguals dream in different languages? In a little study I carried out, some 64% of bilinguals and trilingual people said that they dreamed in one or the other language, depending on the dream, or in other words, when a language was involved, obviously. Once again, the complementarity concept is at work here. Depending upon the circumstance and the individual they are dreaming about, they will use the one language, the other, or both. Does speaking different languages affect the way bilinguals feel and think? Some bilinguals report being different in each of their languages. It has even been proposed that bilinguals change personality when they change language. I have written 2 posts on this subject, and generally, what's seen as a real change in personality is most probably just a shift in attitudes and habits that correspond to a shift in circumstance or context, independent of language. That is really true of monolinguals also. They might well behave in a different way and in some cases change mindsets and feelings with different people, even though the language is the exact same. When bilinguals talk, do they mentally translate from language 1 to language 2? Translating from language 1 to language 2 is mainly found in the early phases of second language acquisition. When people end up being bilingual, meaning use 2 or more languages in daily life, they no longer translate or only do so on uncommon occasions. When kids are introduced to 2 languages concurrently, how does it affect their development? i.e., does it delay their speech? Do they end up with a smaller-sized vocabulary in each language? An older myth surrounding bilingualism is that bilingual kids are postponed in their language development. There is simply no research evidence to that effect, and we now know that their rate of language acquisition is the same as that of their monolingual counterparts. When it comes to lexical knowledge in multilingual kids, I discuss this complex issue in a post which shows that children are influenced by the complementarity concept, as are adults. What do you think is the biggest advantage of bilingualism? Instead of giving just one, enable me to note some advance by bilinguals themselves. They can communicate with different people of different cultures in different countries. They feel that understanding some languages helps them get other languages. Bilingualism fosters receptivity, others different perspectives on life, and decreases cultural lack of knowledge. It also gives you more job chances and greater social movement. Chapter 8. How to Raise a Multilingual Kid. Giving your kids the gift of bilingualism can enrich their life. In a world that's becoming progressively globalized and varied, the capability to speak more than one language may be a preferable quality, especially because bilingualism provides social, economic, and intellectual benefits. 80% of Americans actually believe that children should learn a second language with complete confidence before finishing from high school. If you share the sentiment of wishing to raise a multilingual child, here are 7 evidence-based ideas on how to promote successful dual language acquisition in kids. While some of these methods are most applicable to families that are already multilingual, others will work even if you don't speak another language yourself. 1. Boost language quantity. The amount of linguistic input children receive in each of their languages predicts vocabulary and grammatical development. The richer the input, the higher the possibility of successful language acquisition. That is an example. Kids who hear a lot of words have a larger vocabulary size. Do not underestimate the power of consistently revealing your child to 2 languages. 2. Increase language quality. Quality of linguistic input also affects kids' language outcomes. Having stimulating in-person interactions with caretakers is vital in helping children obtain language. For example, reading books to kids supports language development, while language exposure by means of television does not. Low-quality television direct exposure has actually been connected with lower vocabulary scores in bilingual kids. Simply put, aim for more face time and choose educational or top-quality children's television when possible. 3. Get the help of friends and family. Variability in language input is another essential predictor of language development. Having regular interactions with various speakers of the two languages can help enhance bilingual proficiency, as kids are exposed to more variety. To put it simply, having interactions with extended members of the family, grandparents, and friends who speak the other language provides further advantage for kids' development. 4. Select a method that works best for your family. There are many different ways to expose your kid to two languages, depending upon the family. Though no single technique has been recognized as the best for raising bilingual kids, some have been found to support multilingual language development. For instance, there is the one-person, one-language approach, typically used by two parents or caretakers who speak different languages, or parent A speaks one language, parent B speaks another language. In another common method, a kid is exposed to one language, usually a minority language, sometimes described as a heritage language, in the home, and a second language, normally the majority language, in school. A very different technique could be to speak to your kid in a much different language each day of the week. You can also develop your own method. For instance, some parents or caretakers have reported that if a kid has watched Frozen 1,000,000 times and knows every line by heart, having her watch it in Spanish next time might result in her picking up Spanish vocabulary along the way. 5. Consider multilingual education. During early development, there might be a choice of providing multilingual childcare by using sitters or caregivers who speak another language. Once your child is of school age, consider schools with two-way immersion programs, which include students of two different native languages in the same classroom and teach content classes in those two languages. Aside from providing children with constant exposure to two languages across disciplines, which increases the likelihood of the students achieving proficiency in both languages, our research shows that two-way immersion programs also promote students' scholastic achievements. If two-way immersion programs are not available in your school district, there may be other alternatives. After-school or weekend language lessons also provide a formal instructional setting that can promote second language acquisition. Places of worship can also be useful resources if you're attempting to raise your child to speak a language that's associated with your faith. 6. Let your child be a leader. Pay attention to hints from your child and follow their interests. Language development is most successful when kids interact with attentive and sensitive grown-ups. A child is more likely to learn new words when an adult focuses on items that the kid is interested in instead of what the adult is interested in. Your child will have a greater chance of success in getting two languages if they're engaged. To motivate learning, try to find activities including two languages that interest your child. 7. Continue informing yourself about bilingual language development. Discover more about bilingualism yourself. There are many misconceptions surrounding raising a multilingual kid. For example, there are beliefs that multilingualism leads to language conditions and learning special needs, or that multilingual children are confused by hearing more than one language. However, these myths have been exposed. Multilingual children actually accomplish essential language turning points at the exact same rate as monolingual kids. Last ideas. Although there are no universal guidelines to follow when it comes to raising a bilingual kid, the most crucial thing to do as a parent or caretaker is to supply nurturing support. The technique that you wind up taking will depend on the nature of your family, the area you live in, and the resources that are available to you. At the end of the day, concentrate on raising a happy kid. The capability to speak 2 languages and the cognitive, neurological, and social advantages that come with it are an included benefit. This has been Accelerated Learning. Learn faster through memorizing, multilingual education, and curiosity by Corey Hansen. Narrated by Mark Milroy. Accelerated Learning. Information about consciousness, awareness, and memorization techniques by Corey Hansen. Narrated by Mark Milroy. Chapter 1. Increase your children's test success with neurological techniques. Help your kids build strong memories and test-taking abilities. With the help of connections from neuroscience research, you can use best brain practices to help your kids build the learning routines for best memory and test-taking skills while also sustaining or restoring a favorable attitude about school. The bleak surface of memorization. Rote memorization comprises approximately 70% of a student's research study time. Each year, as more info is contributed to every subject, the volume of material that needs to be remembered boosts. Test-taking should be an opportunity for children to show what they know and understand, but the No Kid Left Behind system of examining the success of a school is by the cumulative test result averages of all students. Those are usually multiple-choice tests that are more an evaluation of rote memory than an assessment of what a kid actually learned and will retain as knowledge. Because standardized tests are likely to be the basis of federal funding of schools for the foreseeable future, and simply because instructors are under massive pressure to raise test scores, the pressure of test performance can be stressful even to children as young as second graders. At some point in early elementary school, children begin taking spelling and arithmetic tests. If these first test experiences are positive, they're at an advantage because they are more likely to approach future tests with self-confidence, and tension will not block memory storage and retrieval. Though, when it comes to many kids, these first experiences are negative, and your child stresses in formal test situations or has trouble remembering facts, he'll need support from you to build his self-confidence and find which methods are best matched for his success. You can guide your child to develop the research study skills most matched for the way his brain learns and remembers best. The results will appear on his test scores and, more importantly, in his power as a lifelong learner. The brain looks for patterns, so help your children activate anticipation. Comprehending how the brain makes and stores short-term working memories and converts them into long-lasting long-term memories will help you guide your children through methods that will empower them to extend their memory capacity, reduce aggravation, and promote test-taking skills and success. Only when the brain acknowledges relationships right between the new and prior knowledge can it hold on to new info. When the new input gets in the working memory building zone, the hippocampus, deep in the emotional brain, it triggers a search throughout the brain's memory storage areas for kept memory with related patterns. When there's a match, a link to the related pattern decreases to the hippocampus to hang on to that new input. If pattern matching succeeds, the new input is physically encoded into a brain cell network with the related memory. Activating related memory patterns before the new learning supports the brain's pattern seeking and makes it more likely that the new info will stick. This process is called activation of anticipation. Activate prior knowledge bridges. You can activate anticipation bridges best if you know what topic your child will be learning next in school and helping him switch on existing memory circuits that relate to what he is going to be taught. Your preparations before the class lesson, like advising him of past experiences and interests that activate his anticipation circuits, will give him the advantage in linking and locking in the upcoming lesson. Preparing the brain bridges so learning sticks. The best connections to anticipation activate memories that were positive, relate the upcoming subject to personal interests, or draw links from the subject to things your child finds pertinent. You will have to be extremely creative to find ways to connect your kids' anticipation or interests with some of the topics mandated on tests, such as memorizing the dates for individual battles in the Revolutionary War, or the names of the innovators of the cotton gin, sewing device, and cyclotron. But if it will be tested, your efforts will yield stronger memory storage. To prepare existing memory pattern circuits, enhance the links that connect with new learning. Go over things he is already thinking about that will be included in the upcoming class lessons. Rather than just asking what he learned in school each day and getting a minimal reaction, or even worse yet, the comment, "nothing," make your questions more personally relevant. Motivate him to tell you what he was taught that reminds him of things he likes, has done, or wants to do. For instance, if the school lesson is about a part of the nation you checked out as a family or a part of the world from which your relatives immigrated, look at photos of the trip, or have him talk with his relatives about things they experienced or found out about that make that part of the world. Other ways to connect new associated input with existing knowledge include doing an internet search together about a country she's studying. Start with things she is interested in, like the dogs or horses that stemmed there, or their current sports teams. Use Google Earth to zoom in on spots of interest to her in that country. Contribute to your kids' prior background knowledge by watching video on the internet associated to upcoming class topics. If the class will be studying the geography of mountains or science of weather, watch a video about Mount Everest to stir interest and provide a background of related memory onto which your child can hook the new information he will hear in class. Preheat interest and memory by showing your child high-interest discoveries and developments that happened because of the science they are going to study. If the topic of research study is colonial times, watch a video or look at a few websites connecting to that theme. Ask questions that prompt your kid to specify any similarities between herself and people throughout that historical age. Emotions are necessary prior memory link boosters. When she is discovering the leaders of the early groups, ask her what qualities she would want to see in the leader of a club or group she was thinking of joining. When those memories are stimulated, your kid's neural networks and stored patterns are primed to look for and get in touch with related new info. Ask questions that prompt your child. These exact same techniques of customization, importance, and connection to prior knowledge and interest apply to reading homework. Ask your child to tell you about any personal connections he can make with the characters or issues in a unique history chapter, rather than just requesting for a synopsis or drilling him about the facts he might be tested on. His voluntary, positive interest connections will build much more powerful memories and work as a link for future details to join as he continues to read. Psychological control for long-term memory. The most effective forms of review are those that give your children chances to actively think, analyze, and examine the information in their prefrontal cortex where long-term memories are built. Each time learning is recalled or used, the repeated neural activation makes the memory circuit stronger, like working out a muscle. Promote this memory strength with mental manipulation of new learning. One such control is to have your kid summarize new learning in her own words. Ways to do this include having one child teach the information to a sibling, to the family at the table, or during a vehicle ride. Children can also write summaries of the day's learning in a log or diary committed to the subject and include their choice of tailored artwork, diagrams, images from publications, or the Internet. Other ways of cementing learning is by synthesizing understanding. This takes place when kids use the learning and transfer it to represent it in a new way. These opportunities can be related to your children's talents and interests, such as creating a web page or PowerPoint, developing a parlor game, writing or showing the topic in a book or video for a younger child, creating a sales brochure or other marketing materials about the topic, come and see the fjords of Norway, why you should join the Jamestown group, or live in Michigan and get to experience all phases of the rainfall cycle. Memory-sustaining adjustments are specifically strong when performed within the first 24 hours of new learning. To encourage this routine, motivate your child to make more connections between the new learning and things he already knows, so his brain stores new learning in more than one relational memory circuit. Each time your kid acknowledges more relationships between new learning and prior knowledge, it will change his brain, as neuroplasticity really stimulates more connections and more powerful links between the brain's nerve cell circuits. That is the neurons that fire together, wire together process that constructs more courses linking up with the new learning, axon coding, synapses, dendrites, to keep it ingrained in long-lasting memory. Charts and diagrams, like a piece of butcher block paper on your daughter's wall where she adds new subject info as she discovers it, is a great visual organizer to strengthen and build memory links. Positive emotional strength is added when she adds her own viewpoints or sketches that represent her feelings about the info. Other opportunities to build and expand those long-term memory patterns include similarities or differences defined, listed, or charted on a poster. Categorizing, sorting examples of the new topic into lists such as mammals, reptiles, amphibians, solids, liquids, and gases. Compare and contrast, like with graphic organizers or visual maps. You will not only help your children's test success, but also help them build better brains by increasing their capability to connect learning with positive experiences, interests, prior knowledge, and existing memory patterns. With satisfying evaluation activities that get in touch with your children's learning strengths, their brain's own neuroplasticity will build more efficient neural networks to store and help them rapidly retrieve the info they study. Each memory structure and enhancing process paves the way for the next success as learning promotes learning. It is a great cycle to build. Chapter 2. The Role of Information in Consciousness. The mindful experience of our environments includes some forms of attention, from bottom-up automated attention to a more focused top-down attention. These forms of attention all count on neural mechanisms that process information in a more selective manner. It's pretty simple to see that attention runs on info. When it comes to the incredible experience of awareness, is info and attention needed? Attention does appear to be a big part of the mindful experience, and even in the most minimal experiences of awareness, there appears to be some form of signal processing. Whether it is selective attention is arguable. So a big part of consciousness naturally involves the processing of info. However, is any particular type of info necessary for awareness? Does conscious awareness depend upon a kind of information that is uniquely related to awareness and absolutely nothing else? The first thing we really need to specify is information. Basically, information includes the relaying of a message of some kind, which ideally would be processed without losing its original meaning. That is, Shannon's info concept deals with this reduction in uncertainty and entropy. This message can include written or verbal language, proprioceptive feedback, sounds, visual content, and other forms. When it comes to human psychology, beneath all these messages are neural signals that relay this info. In the case of evolution, genes carry this information, and for machines, these signals take digital form. All of these need both the sender and receiver of the signals to share a common comprehension of their meaning, which already introduces a source of errors or sound. The analysis of this information is a separate problem. If information has a practical role in cognitive procedures, and even evolutionary processes, then it fundamentally has some sort of meaning. Attentional mechanisms have progressed to process ecological information in a way that supports the survival of an organism, from pests to humans. That isn't extremely questionable. Attentional systems show the selectivity of signal processing that permitted an organism to effectively navigate in its environment, that is, searching for food, breeding. From feature detection to object recognition to tool usage, these are seen in the animal world with increasing complexity. Attention is meant to optimize the processing of info associated to these jobs. Without info, it would be hard to picture what attention would do. The role of consciousness within all this is still debated. There is little agreement on its evolutionary purpose and whether or not it can be described in evolutionary terms. Nonetheless, there are some elements of survival that awareness appears to promote, namely, the capability to empathize with other organisms for social interactions, also seen in the animal kingdom, and the possible amplification of signals to totally engage the organism in a task, that is, conscious attention. Think about the feelings related to a really frightening or very enjoyable situation. You do not just seem to be processing info or just attending to the situation. You seem to be immersed and fully engaged in it. Information is vital to these conscious processes, further clarifying the relationship between attention and consciousness and how they connect to benefit an organism. It is uncertain, though, whether all forms of awareness require info, as specified above. The feeling related to incredible consciousness, for instance, may require some signals to be processed, that is, ambient temperature, sounds, touch, but not in a selective way, thus not requiring selective attention. However, even this seems to involve some form of info processing. These neural signals communicate info that's processed within a framework of understanding. This is also important when we consider the info communicated in language and how the coordination of this context between the transmitter and the receiver of info is necessary, as we had discussed previously. We will stop here for now, but we'll get into more details about this topic in the next series of posts. Our aim is now to focus on the role of info in cognitive processes and in consciousness. We will check out several theories and perspectives that could help us better understand how info affects our mindful experience and how this processing of information affects the advancement of our species and the artifacts we produce. We will illustrate all this with some characters, different types of informivores. Humans truly are omnivorous when it comes to info, and this voracity for information plainly should have played some role in our development. Maybe we were not always so insatiable, much more just recently in our history. Having these characters engage with one another will hopefully allow us to clarify the questions emerging from our discussion concerning awareness and info. Chapter 3: Awareness and Language. Language is one of the most distinguishing characteristics of the human species. There are good reasons to actually believe it is a uniquely human capability that no other organism has. Unlike other species, we learn complex linguistic rules easily and without voluntary mindful effort during the early years of our lives. As our vocabulary boosts, we are able to parse not only the structure of sentences and the role and meaning of words, but also the method which sentences and words can be used for social and useful purposes. We learn, for example, that the exact same sentence, "This is actually good," can be a compliment, an honest assertion, or a joke, depending on the context and intonation of the speaker's voice. Social behaviors increase in complexity because of language. Rational capabilities also increase with language, since language permits us to make our thoughts specific. In addition, language enables the practice of overtly requesting reasons, a structure for obtaining knowledge. Humankind ended up being sapiens mainly just because of language. The circumstance, however, is quite different with respect to the role of awareness, particularly the kind of subjective experience associated with phenomenal consciousness. For example, what it is like to experience pain or fear. While awareness is frequently connected with our comprehension of meanings, the relation between language and consciousness isn't uncomplicated, and it is being more difficult to establish this relationship because consciousness seems to be present in many species, while language is not. We can call this issue the drastically unequal distribution of language. It appears that language developed rather recently in humans. Awareness, at least in its fundamental experiential form, developed in so many species and most likely much earlier than language. We talk more about this and the consciousness-attention dissociation in a former post and in Montemayor and Halagian, 2015. That is a vexing issue because consciousness appears to be inherently related to intelligence and cognitive versatility, and for that reason, to language's ability to ground human rationality. Intuitively, it feels that there must be an important relationship between language and awareness. Maybe language is even a required condition for awareness. This would, though, restrict awareness to people if it turns out that language is indeed a uniquely human capacity. For that reason, the difficulty in the question that needs to be attended to. First, we need a grasp of language and its role in cognition. One view is that linguistic capabilities structure thinking. As the format for inferential reasoning, language may not only be a capacity to communicate, but essentially the method by which ideas are encoded. Language is clearly necessary for all types of reports concerning our mental life, and because of this, it is critical for the capability for reporting mindful states. Actually, the really reportable essence of our frame of minds depends on linguistic capabilities, although some basic communication can take place non-linguistically through gestures, but this still needs some form of semantic understanding. Importantly, it is in virtue of our language capabilities that we have access to our thoughts and to the thoughts of others. If one envisages consciousness as access to our ideas for action and report, the so-called access awareness, then it is entirely unsurprising that language could be considered as an essential condition for awareness. But there are alternative ways of comprehending language. That is an example. One could think of language not as a symbolic format used for accessing contents and drawing reasonings, or symbolic representations, but rather as a set of natural abilities that enable the possibilities for action, which are embedded in our interaction with the environment. This would belong to affordances. The main idea here is that the important distinction between human language and other animal sorts of communication isn't a difference in kind. That is, it is not a completely different type of capability, but rather it is an important difference in complexity. To put it simply, our language abilities are more abstract and inferentially intricate than the communication abilities of any other species, which is related to our ability to have extremely intricate interactions with our environment and with others. In principle, though, the same dynamical, proficient, and ecologically grounded capabilities that constitute language could be found in other species. This is a possible view from an evolutionary perspective, which keeps away from the issue of the uneven distribution of language. But notice that even with this less symbolic view of language, its main function is still associated to thinking and reasoning for action, and to accessing info in an epistemic way, in a way that warranties success and the increased probability of true belief. Even though it is obvious that on this view some animals may have language, which is a benefit if one thinks about language to be a needed condition for awareness, this view is not without issues. Two prominent troubles for this view are A. Figuring out how a semantics based upon content and goals has the capacity of explaining the inferential and hierarchical structure of sentences, which is fundamental for language comprehension, and B. Identifying whether or not designating many species into language speakers comes at the cost of blurring the distinction between communication in general and linguistic syntactic communication in specific. Since approaches to language have to do with access to information and inferential reasoning for action, it seems that language may well be a necessary condition for access consciousness. But what about extraordinary consciousness? The framework detailing the consciousness-attention dissociation offers a solution to the troublesome relation between language and awareness. While access awareness and complex cross-modal attention to contents may necessitate language, extraordinary consciousness may not demand language. This proposition is useful in tons of ways. For example, sensational consciousness may be present in many species, while language might be limited to human beings, depending upon how one specifies language. But here we are talking about the capability to communicate in a linguistic, syntactic way. This perspective also records standard intuitions about the nature of mindful experiences. For example, why would the epistemic functions of language be needed to experience pain or fear? Is it not possible for a living being to experience standard experiences and feelings without a symbolic way of identifying principles or semantic contents, or separately of ways of accessing possibilities for action? The view that language is a required condition for incredible awareness, or basic subjective experience, which includes something like experiencing pain, is becoming less plausible because of theoretical reasons, such as those presented by CAD, and also simply because of empirical findings, like those concerning the neural correlates of standard emotions. Distinguishing access to information, or access consciousness, from phenomenal consciousness helps clarify why we associate not only intelligence with access consciousness, but also ethical standing with phenomenal awareness. That distinction is deeply related to the question of what exactly could be the role of phenomenal consciousness. If one holds the view that sensational consciousness doesn't play any role, that is, as it were, just sits there in us, then one commits to a sort of epiphenomenalist view, that consciousness is just a byproduct of cognitive processing without any significant purpose. Our company believes that this view is mistaken. Chapter 4. Visual Attention and Awareness. We all have an intuitive understanding of what it means to pay attention to a specific visual scene or a discussion, and that it must be in some way associated to our conscious awareness. But what exactly is meant by the term attention from a more clinical and speculative perspective? Our conversation will focus on visual attention, since there are a vast number of empirical studies on it, and vision is a huge part of our mindful experience. Normally speaking, visual attention is a system or group of mechanisms that selectively filters visual info and satisfies of helping an organism perform actions like browsing through space, finding food or mates, staying away from predators, and completing more complex tasks such as using tools. We need not understand this selective visual info processing. In fact, most of it happens outside of mindful consciousness, and there are many studies that offer support for that claim, at least in humans. There's a pretty good review on this topic by Van Boxtel. We should make the point here that discussions about attention and the info that it processes implicitly really need to attend to how it communicates with memory systems, but we can just concentrate on attention for our purposes. There are many forms of visual attention that work on numerous levels, both within and beyond our mindful experience. They include feature-based attention, which is attention to particular functions like color, sector orientation, or movement. Spatial attention, which is attention to the layout of functions or objects. And object-based attention, which is attention to things that display object-like properties, such as a cohesive set of features with a typical fate. These are primary, yet overlapping, categories to define the types of info that visual attention can process and run upon. It becomes more complex when you look at cross-modal attention, where info from auditory, visual, or haptic sources are integrated. This needs a worldwide workspace, where the different forms of attention within and across methods can be combined as belonging to the same item or event. One can also characterize attention by describing the ways in which it can be deployed. Some forms of attention can occur automatically, also called bottom-up attention, while other forms of attention are more deliberate, called top-down attention. However, this difference isn't always so clear-cut. Some tasks that require a lot of top-down attention initially can end up being automated and uncomplicated. Think about when first learning to type or play the piano. Eventually, those complex and deliberate tasks can end up being effortless to perform and can produce a sense of flow that requires extremely little mindful monitoring of visual info processing or other forms of concentrated attention. Such examples farther complicate our understanding of attention, since its relationship to conscious experience appears to change over time, and analyzing this change in time might be especially informative to our comprehension of consciousness. A crucial characteristic of the various forms of attention is that they can be described functionally. Attention satisfies of helping an organism in its interactions with its environment, a function that is important for survival. Consequently, we can give an evolutionary story to the development of attentional systems, from basic feature processing mechanisms to more complicated object-based representations, to the multimodal incorporation of sensory info. That evolutionary story is reflected by the company of the visual system in the brain from more standard processing parts near the brainstem, like attention to functions, to higher-level modulation of attention happening in the cortex, like object-based attention. Remarkably, there isn't much work on detailing the evolution of attention specifically. We will further discuss this evolutionary element of attention in a subsequent post. This description of visual attention as something that regulates visual info processing either immediately or deliberately is the beginning point for our comprehension of the relationship between attention and awareness. It is essential to stress that attention can happen either with or without conscious awareness. The distinction between conscious and unconscious forms of attention makes the study of mindful awareness quite hard, but also very fascinating. What are the crucial elements that determine what information goes into awareness? Clearly, we often are well aware of the affective and conceptual information that's unimportant to the job at hand, and which isn't plainly related to action or decision-making. Therefore, it appears that attention is not an ideal analog for awareness, specifically since there may be non-attentive-based forms of awareness. Nevertheless, attention is maybe the most natural entry into conscious awareness. A way better comprehension of how attention works and how it is related to conscious consciousness can eventually cause a better understanding of consciousness. Our next post will present more differences and dissociations within the world of the philosophical theories of conscious awareness. Chapter 5. What does information look like in the brain? In Dante's Inferno, the fifth circle of hell is a location where the wrathful fight each other for eternity. Similarly, I often consider YouTube remarks to be an extra-canonical circle of hell where the giants fight one another for eternity. You might, then, imagine my surprise when I found many thoughtful comments expressing wonder and intrigue on a YouTube video of brain activity in a zebrafish. In the video, which showcases a cutting-edge brain imaging method, neurons throughout the brain of the fish illuminate like fireflies and dance with purpose. At one point in the video, the whole brain shines with a brilliant glimmer. I think the zebrafish had a surprise at 19 seconds, one commenter writes. I think the fish may have gotten startled, another individual chimes in. Just imagine how a human brain would look using this exact same technique, says another commenter. The moment of puppy love, fear, or anguish, it would all appear like a continuum of electrical stimulus, but each event slowly taking our character and perception. Does a light bulb moment really seem like a light bulb in the brain? Does thinking harder or experiencing deep emotions like love, fear, or distress illuminate more nerve cells? If the meme about only using 10% of our brains held true, would using 100% of our brain logically lead to a stroke of genius? Probably not. To examine how cells in the brain light up in reaction to learning, a group led by Takaaki Komiyama used a comparable imaging method to study nerve cells in mice. Continuing a line of questions begun by the late Walter J. Freeman III, Komiyama and associates imaged the part of the brain that reacts to smells, called the olfactory bulb, as the mice learned smells. While Freeman had performed similar tryouts, electrodes gauging voltage, this group pictured the activity of the olfactory bulb with a fluorescent color that glows when calcium hurries into a neutron. Using this technique, Komiyama's group observed the activity of mitral cells, excitatory cells that send smell info to the cerebral cortex, and granule cells, repressive cells with regional connections. When a mouse was exposed to a new odor, all mitral cells illuminated in an almost unanimous glow. Yet, after several days of smell learning, just a few mitral cells eventually responded to the smell. Even complete stranger, if the mouse were put under anesthesia, essentially all mitral cells again reacted in unison, regardless of the mouse being unconscious. Inhibitory granule cells, which don't send out information directly to the cortex, revealed the opposite activity as mitral cells. Novella odors and smells presented under anesthesia elicited little reaction, though odor learning triggered unanimous activity. It looks like a real paradox. Why do cells that carry odor information to the cortex respond less as a group to smells the mouse has learned and more to smells that the mouse does not recognize? In the phantasmagoria of the brain, shouldn't lack of knowledge be dark and knowledge bright? Get in info theory. Once considered as nebulous and subjective, researchers are now treating info as a basic quantity, like mass or energy. That revolution, which started with the first info theorist, Claude Shannon, specifies info as decrease in uncertainty. Picture you are playing hangman with a good friend. Not understanding the word your good friend has picked, you might play it safe and choose a vowel. But since vowels are really common, understanding there's an E in your good friend's word doesn't offer many clues. Suppose instead you take a risk and guess a rare letter like Z or X. Finding an X limits the possible words substantially. For this reason, the letter X carries more information than vowels like E. To measure this reduction in uncertainty, Shannon gauged information in bits by considering the probability that a state, like a letter or a Chinese character, may occur. Because there are more characters in Chinese script than there are letters in the English alphabet, each Chinese character is relatively uncommon and carries more information. By contrast, a coin with two possible states, heads and tails, carries exactly one little bit of info, like the answer to a yes or no question. Importantly, signals can carry info without meaning. Information concept considers only possibility and not semantics. To carry information, a brain must have the ability to select from a very big collection of possible states. A brain whose neurons all fire in unison is a lot like an alphabet with only two letters: on, shooting, and off, not shooting. Indeed, a loss of consciousness accompanies many neurons acting in unison throughout sleep, anesthesia, and seizures, minimizing the informative content of the brain. By contrast, when only a small number of neurons react to a stimulus, they form an unusual state and reduce unpredictability, much like the letter X in the game of hangman. Over the course of learning a smell, inhibitory granule cells appear to sculpt such uncommon states from the distributed activity of mitral cells by silencing all but a select few. This technique is referred to as sparse coding because info is encoded with few events. Sporadic coding saves the brain energy and might appear to oppose Freeman's observation that meaning is communicated over big spatial patterns of activity. Yet, sparse coding doesn't mean that quiet cells are unimportant. If we ignore the silent cells, we're entrusted a smaller alphabet, and information is lost. An even bigger repertoire of states is enabled if we consider 4 dimensions, 3 of space and 1 of time. In more arrangement with Freeman's findings, Komiyama's group noted that mitral cell activity changes over a brief period of time immediately following the odor sniff. Written alphabets are structured, and info usually suggests order. Yet, Shannon named his step of information entropy, a term which means disorder. Because disordered systems can be arranged in a bigger number of ways than orderly systems, they have a bigger collection of states and carry more information. Certainly, mitral cells progress from an extremely ordered state, all cells in arrangement, to an extremely disordered state, cells responding disharmoniously with the course of learning. Likewise, your bedroom most likely moves from a neat, orderly state to a disheveled mess with time. In fact, the second law of thermodynamics tells us that the disorder of any closed system increases with time unless work is done to organize it. In many cases, though, a passive process of collecting information about parts of a system can be used to organize it, instead of an active process of doing work. That appears to undermine the second law. Imagine organizing a large kennel of dogs according to pet dog breed by passively opening a partition in the kennel rather than actively going after individual dogs. The surprise, however, that collecting info itself creates disorder elsewhere means that the second law has not been breached. The psychologist Carl Jung once said, "In all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder a secret order." Also, in all order there's a void, a great scarcity of info. As neuroscience becomes increasingly driven by visual images that galvanize funding, the public takes pleasure in flashy videos of the brain lighting up. But for the zebrafish we visited at the beginning of this post, her brightest moment might also have been her dimmest. Order is simple and easy to accept. What takes courage is to embrace the mayhem and accept disorder. Chapter 6. No more flashcards with memorization through computer game playing. Computer games will not replace classroom learning experiences. The largest obstacle in school is the overpacked curriculum with focus on rote memorization and preparation for high-stakes screening. The availability of well-researched information to guide and direct parents in your usage of game-structured learning tools will support your children's acquisition of requisite foundational rote facts and treatments. Online learning practice games that are the most pleasurable and successful offers continuous evaluation of your child's mastery and constantly upgrade the level of difficulty to suit the player. The best games also supply your kid with frequent corrective feedback, chances for self-correction, extension of skills to problem solving, and goal progress monitoring and feedback for your kid and you to see ongoing progress. These best programs can achieve what is not feasible in whole class instruction or drill because students' levels of proficiency vary considerably. It is humanly unrealistic to give each student customized, continuous formative and corrective evaluation, level of proficiency change, and goal progress feedback for multiplying tables, spelling, science terms, or historical facts mandated for memorization. This way of learning is so successful because, just as with video games bet pleasure and not linked to particular school ability practice, the progressive difficulty and feedback deals with the brain's intrinsic reward system to encourage perseverance and memory. This is the reaction from the brain's own dopamine reward system. Perseverance, regardless of errors and setbacks, is continual and precise memory networks constructed through the regular corrective feedback that increases success and mastery. This restorative feedback and further practice in the parts of difficulty actually change the brain's circuitry. The corrected practice activates long-lasting acquisition of info into long-term memory because of the brain's neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the brain's self-construction of more powerful memory connections when the memory is activated. Practice does make long-term because each time a memory is activated, practiced, used, the electricity streaming through the neural circuit stimulates the putting down of more connecting dendrites, layers of insulating myelin around axons, and more synapses connecting axons and dendrites. Kids in the game-learning, neurochemical state of achievement-driven pleasure work at their own personalized levels and rates to learn the critical foundational accurate and procedural information. As this most engaged and inspired state persists, the awareness that their effort can bring objective access promotes the turnaround from repaired to development attitudes. When your children master the memorization of critical fundamental knowledge through the best online learning games and programs, progressing at their individualized achievement levels, they will become more joyful and successful learners. They will experience the fixed mindset changing power of being frequently familiar with their incremental progress, with the result of an understanding that effort leads to achievement. How do neuroplasticity and neurogenesis rewire your brain? For over a whole decade, neuroscientists have been attempting to figure out how neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons, and neuroplasticity, the malleability of neural circuits, interact to improve how we think, remember, and behave. This week, an eye-opening new study, Adult-born neurons modify excitatory synaptic transmission to existing nerve cells, reported how newborn neurons, created through neurogenesis, weave themselves into a new and enhanced neural tapestry. The January 2017 findings were released in the diary eLife. Throughout this cutting-edge study on mice, neuroscientists at the University of Alabama at Birmingham found that the mix of neurogenesis and neuroplasticity triggered less fit older neurons to fade into oblivion and die off as the sprightly young newborn nerve cells took over existing neural circuits by making more robust synaptic connections. For their latest UAB study, Linda Overstreet Wadish and Jacques Wadish, who are both associate professors at the University of Alabama at Birmingham Department of Neurobiology, concentrated on neurogenesis in the dentate gyrus area of the hippocampus. The dentate gyrus is an epicenter of neurogenesis, accountable for the formation of new episodic memories and the spontaneous exploration of novel environments, to name a few functions. More specifically, the scientists focused on freshly born granule cell nerve cells in the dentate gyrus that should end up being wired into a neural network by forming synapses through neuroplasticity so as to survive and take part in ongoing neural circuit function. There are only two major brain areas that are currently believed to have the ability to constantly give birth to new nerve cells via neurogenesis in grown-ups. One is the hippocampus, long-term and spatial memory hub. The second is the cerebellum, coordination and muscle memory hub. Especially, granule cells have the greatest rate of neurogenesis. Both the hippocampus and cerebellum are loaded, chock full with granule cells. Interestingly, Moderate to vigorous physical activity, MVPA, is just one of the most effective ways to stimulate neurogenesis and the birth of new granule cells in the hippocampus and the cerebellum. Granule cells were first determined by Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who made lovely sketches in 1899 that illustrate how granule cells produce synaptic connections with Purkinje cells in the cerebellum. Speculatively, this could be one reason that scent plays such an enduring and ever-changing role in our memory development and remembrance of things past. Neurogenesis and neuroplasticity interact to rewire neural circuitry. One of the key aspects of neural plasticity is called neural Darwinism, or neural pruning, which means that any neuron that isn't fired and wired together into a network is very likely to be extinguished. The most recent UAB research suggests that newborn nerve cells play a role in expediting this process by winning out in a survival of the fittest kind of neuronal fight against their more senior or broken equivalents. Long before there were neuroscientific research studies on neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, Henry David Thoreau unwittingly described the process of how the courses that one's mind travels can become hardwired when you get stuck in a rut, by describing a well-worn course through the woods. In Walden, Thoreau writes, "The surface of the earth is soft and impressible by the feet of men, and so with the courses which the mind travels. How worn and dusty, then, should be the highways of the world, how deep the ruts of custom and conformity." From a mental standpoint, the most recent UAB discovery presents the interesting possibility that when adult-born neurons weave into existing neural networks, that new memories are created and older memories might be customized. Through neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, it might be possible to take a fresh and unworn course for your thoughts to travel upon. One could hypothesize that this process opens up the possibility to reinvent yourself and move from the status quo, or to get rid of past traumatic events that evoke anxiety and tension. Hardwired, fear-based memories often lead to avoidance habits that can hold you back from living your life to the fullest. Future research study on neurogenesis could result in new PTSD treatments. Granule cells in the dentate gyrus belong to a neural circuit that processes sensory and spatial input from other parts of the brain. By integrating sensory and spatial information, the dentate gyrus has the capability to produce special and detailed memories of an experience. Before this research study, Overstreet Wadish and her UAB associates had several standard questions about how the newly born granule cells in the dentate gyrus function. They asked themselves two particular questions. Since the number of nerve cells in the dentate gyrus increases by neurogenesis while the number of nerve cells in the cortex remains the same, does the brain create added synapses from the cortical neurons to the new granule cells? Or do some cortical neurons move their connections from mature granule cells to the new granule cells? Through a series of complex tryouts, mice, Overstreet Wadish et al. Found that some of the cortical neurons in the cortex moved all of their previous connections with older granule cells that might have been worn or past their prime to the freshly born granule cells that were raring to go. This advanced discovery opens the door to examine how the redistribution of synapses between old and new neurons helps the dentate gyrus stay up to date by forming new connections. One of the crucial questions the scientists want to dive deeper into during upcoming experiments is, how does this redistribution relate to the useful impacts of exercise, which is a natural way to increase neurogenesis? In the future, it is possible that advanced research on neurogenesis and neuroplasticity could cause finely tuned neurobiological treatments for ailments such as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and dementia. In a statement to UAB, Overstreet Wadish said, "Over the past 10 years, there has been proof supporting a redistribution of synapses between old and new neurons, possibly by a competitive process that the new cells tend to win. Our findings are very important just because they directly show that, in order for new cells to win connections, the old cells lose connections. So the process of adult neurogenesis not only adds new cells to the network, it promotes plasticity of the existing network. It will be intriguing to check out how neurogenesis-induced plasticity contributes to the function of this brain area. Neurogenesis is normally connected with better acquisition of new info, but some studies have also suggested that neurogenesis promotes forgetting of existing memories. Aerobic exercise is one of the most reliable ways to stimulate neurogenesis and create adult-born neurons. For the past 10 years, the actionable advice I've given in the Sports Player's Way has been rooted in the belief that through the day-to-day process of exercising, anybody can stimulate neurogenesis and optimize his or her state of mind and outlook on life by means of neuroplasticity. The program is developed to improve neural networks and optimize your mindset. Since the start, this program has been based on the discovery that aerobic activity produces brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, and really stimulates the birth of new nerve cells through neurogenesis. I define my philosophy in the introduction to The Athlete's Way. Shifting the focus from inner thighs to more powerful minds makes this exercise book special. The Sports Player's Way doesn't focus just on shaping six-pack abs or molding buns of steel. We are more interested in bulking up your nerve cells and improving your synapses to create a positive, resilient, and determined state of mind. The goal is transformation from the inside out. My objective is to get this message to you so that you can use neurobiology and behavior models to help enhance your life through exercise. I'm a zealot about the power of sweat to transform people's lives by changing their minds. My conviction is strong and genuine because I have lived it. I created the Sports Player's Way in addition to the indispensable help of my late father, Richard Berglund, who was a visionary neuroscientist, neurosurgeon, and author of The Fabric of Mind. A whole decade ago, when I released The Athlete's Way, Sweat and the Biology of Bliss, I put neurogenesis and neuroplasticity in the spotlight. At the time, the discovery of neurogenesis was completely new and still an extreme idea in mainstream neuroscience. In the early 21st century, most experts still believed that human beings were born with all of the nerve cells they would have for their whole lifespan. If anything, it was really believed that people could only lose nerve cells or kill brain cells as we got older. Understandably, When I published The Athlete's Method 2007, there were a ton of doubters and naysayers who thought my ideas about reshaping frame of mind using a combination of neurogenesis and neuroplasticity through moderate to vigorous exercise were ridiculous. For the past 10 years, I have kept my antenna up and my finger on the pulse of all the current research on neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, hoping to find added empirical evidence that gives more clinical credibility to my system of belief and method. Needless to say, I was over the moon and happy today when I read about the new research by Linda Overstreet-Wadish and Jacques Wadish that identifies the specifics of how adult-born neurons customize existing neural circuits. This is interesting stuff. These are amazing times in neuroscience. Modern-day neuroscientific methods are poised to resolve a lot more riddles relating to the complicated system by which neurogenesis and neuroplasticity work together as a dynamic duo to reshape our neural networks and functioning connectivity between brain areas. Stay tuned for future empirical proof and scientific research on neurogenesis and neuroplasticity in the months and years ahead. This has been Accelerated Learning, information about consciousness, awareness, and memorization techniques, by Corey Hansen, narrated by Mark Milroy. Accelerated Learning, understanding how to memorize and change your learning style, by Corey Hansen, narrated by Mark Milroy. Chapter 1. Memorization is not a bad word at all. School is ending, and students surely welcome the break. That being said, they will do quite well to think on how they learn to learn, so that next fall they can be more effective with less effort. Interesting how that reminds me of school in general. In my experience with students, both the university students I teach and the secondary students that teachers tell me about, the biggest weakness students have is that they either try to recall school material by rote memorization or have no technique at all, depending on some kind of magical psychological osmosis. Even amongst students who rely on rote memory, they normally lack much of a strategy for memorizing. Depending on differing degrees of casual looking over the instructional material till they think they can remember it. Experiments show that students regularly overestimate how much they remember and underestimate the value of more research study. Additionally, many teachers at all levels have ridicule for memorization, stating that we should focus education on teaching students to think and solve issues, just as if you can think and resolve issues without understanding anything. A lot of teachers regard remembering as old-fashioned and even destructive of enlightenment. Ridicule for memorization is a relatively new phenomenon in education. In old times, people took great pains and pride in remembering big amounts of info. The introduction of printing greatly decreased the need to memorize history and cultural mores. In contemporary times, we have the web, where you can just Google what you need to know. So who needs to get brain strain attempting to remember things? Now we have a book by Samuel Arbesman, The Half-Life of Facts, Why Everything We Know Has an Expiration Date, where he reasons that there are no lasting facts. They all have a half-life, that is, the number of years it takes to falsify half of what you think are facts. He says that new facts are made all the time, often changing what we had formerly thought were facts. He argues we should just stop remembering and search for whatever existing facts we really need on the web. However, if there are no long-lasting facts, how are those you find on Google any more valid than those you memorize and can deploy in real time? There are some serious errors in Arbesman's position. Many facts are immutable. That is, they don't have a half-life. Events in history did actually take place, and while revisionist writers of school history books might change the reporting of those events, the facts remain true. Nixon covered up Watergate. Obama obfuscated Benghazi. The fact of DNA as a basis for heredity isn't likely to change. Many facts that do change will not change in a given person's life, and hence will work in day-to-day living. The Internet is flooded with error, propaganda, and unvetted assertions. You do not always have Internet access. In many situations, it isn't practical to search for what you need. Ever try to read or speak a foreign language where you have to search for the majority of the words? Ever try to use computer software where you need to repeatedly describe the user's manual? Proficiency in any field of undertaking requires a good deal of memorized facts. And if you want to prosper in life, it pays to be a professional. I can quickly make a strong case for memorization, specifically for schools. Here is a list supporting the importance of memorizing. Memorized information is always with you, even when you lack the time or access to sources where you could look it up. We think and solve issues with what is in working memory, which in turn is memory of presently readily available information, or recall of previously memorized information. The process of thinking is like streaming video on the Internet. Information streams in as brief frames onto the virtual scratchpad of working memory, successively changed by new portions of information from real-time or remembered memory. Many research studies show that the amount of info you can hold in working memory is securely associated with IQ and problem-solving ability. We think by shuttling small batches of information as we experience it or from memory onto a virtual scratchpad called working memory. These batches are shuttled sequentially into our processing networks, idea engine. How well we think depends on what's on the scratchpad. Memorization offers exercise for the mind. This is the reason schools used to need students to remember poems, Bible verses, popular speeches, and so on. The true advantage of such exercise is that it generates mental industriousness. Any instructor will tell you that many students today are mentally lazy. Memorization also trains the mind to focus, and focus intensely. Such ability also seems to be lacking in many youngsters, which is most obvious in the growing number of children detected with ADHD. Memorization trains the brain to develop learning and memory schemas that assist in future learning. Learning schemas develop as you get competence in a part. Call it Skill A. Now, when you need to learn a new and associated skill, B, your mind says to itself, I do not know how to do B. However, I do know how to do A, and some of that can be applied to learning B. Memory schemas are remembered frames of reference and association, where having memorized fact A, you have an association to deal with for remembering fact B. If you learn strategies for memorization, as opposed to the rote memory technique of looking information over repeatedly, you accelerate the ease, speed, and dependability of learning new things. Regardless of where you stand on the significance of memory, Most people really believe that learning is an advantage. But what good is learning if you don't remember it? If you need something now, it's great to have a backup kept in a second place. If you keep double vehicle keys or spare sunglasses in a drawer by the front door, and not just in your bag or jacket pocket, you are a lot more likely to have them rapidly when you need them. The exact same is very true for remembering things you really need to remember. If you want to remember something more easily, you can build that memory and store duplicates of the information in multiple places of your brain's storage system. Learning, examining, and practicing new information through multiple senses does just that. You achieve info storage in multiple brain areas and gain from faster memory construction and access to the information when you want it. Using several senses is a powerful and enjoyable way to build strong memory circuits in less time and keep the info secure in long-term memory. Here's how it works. Chapter 2. Is memorization bad for learning? Making children memorize too much is the issue with USA schools, according to a new motion picture documentary, Race to Absolutely Nowhere. This movie, produced by a homemaker and newbie movie maker, is being embraced all across the country by teachers and parents. It's a bestseller, particularly in New Jersey, where the teachers' union is using the motion picture as a propaganda weapon against Republicans and Governor Christie. That movie is called a must-see by the New York Times. Schools, particularly in New Jersey, are helping to organize public showings. Parents or caretakers, instructors, and academic policymakers are advised to join this propaganda project and shown how to do so on the movie's site. I have dealt with middle school instructors and their schools for 10 years in developing and deploying science curriculum. I think students are asked to memorize too little, not way too much. The motion picture competes that students don't know much simply because they're overwhelmed with more material than their little brains can manage. Nonsense! I know what state requirements require. Trust me, students are not asked to learn way too much. People make excuses for problems in order to stay away from challenging the strong pain of handling the real causes. For example, the film places blame on George Bush for the No Kid Left (NCLB) law. Perhaps most, teachers share in this perverse belief that standards and responsibility screening are the cause of poor schools. No one wants to remember that schools were just as bad during Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton eras when there was no NCLB. SAT scores, for instance, were just as low then as they are now. The real problem with NCLB is No Child Pushed Forward. The focus in schools I know about is on the most affordable common measure of getting the most affordable carrying out students to meet requirements. Students who actually care about learning and the ones who have talent are being cheated by NCLB. We need to rely on the U.S. Army to motivate our kids to be all they can be. Progressives also falsely blame inadequate financing for education. The evidence is perfectly clear that there's no correlation between spending per pupil and academic achievement. Time magazine, not noted for conservatism, explains in an article last December that spending on public schools more than doubled in inflation-adjusted dollars between 1970 and 2007. Moreover, up to 44% of school expenses today are kept off spending plan, so the real expenses are grossly underreported. There's no corresponding enhancement in student learning. Few people, specifically teachers, blame the teachers, and few parents or teachers blame the kids. In the documentary, kids are considered victims of an over-demanding education establishment. No one seems to admit that children might be spoiled with indulgences of all sorts, which include having their poor performance blamed on anything but them. Anyone who thinks there aren't large numbers of lazy, uninspired kids who are uninterested in learning has not been in a classroom lately. Committed teachers knock themselves out attempting to get such kids up to standards. I could practically cry when I see how much these teachers care and how frustrated they are by uncooperative children and parents. The problem isn't the standards or NCLB. A lot of kids think they're smarter than they actually are. They get this inflated view enhanced from doting parents and anybody over 50 gushing over how wise kids are to multitask with all their electronic gizmos. Here's a controversial issue. No one blinks or grumbles when school athletic coaches get in the kids' faces to upbraid them when they're being lazy, unmotivated, or underperforming. But let an instructor do that and he or she would likely be fired on the spot. It's just as though teachers are supposed to make excuses for their students. However, coaches know that excuse-making will not suffice on the playing field. Why should classrooms be any different? To get back to the point of progressives, that school is too hard, I have examined state science requirements in great deal simply because I write middle school science curriculum. The requirements do not need too much memorization. They don't need enough, specifically the kind of memorization where students have to know how to use knowledge in their thinking. I think that the low level of memorization required of students today is a primary reason that so many students have underdeveloped thinking skills. A lot of them mouth platitudes and parrot what others have said. They can't think on their own because they don't know enough to create original and extensive thought. Yet, too many educators dismiss the value of memorization, presuming incorrectly that kids can think with an empty head. Educators tried that several years back with new mathematics, which came a cropper. Now it appears the same ill-begotten beliefs are resurfacing in the framework of state standards and accountability screening. Critical and creative thinking abilities are best developed when students are expected to think for themselves, have viewpoints they can defend with facts and reason, and can convince others to recognize defects in their knowledge and thinking. However, public schools have a politically correct culture where conformity is valued and uniqueness is suspect as antisocial. Conformity and tolerance of ignorance and impracticality are considered the virtues to seek, because all belief systems and views are usually considered equivalent, unless they're conservative. Unequal results are just not fair. So standards need to be set low enough so everybody can master them. We, for this reason, do not expect much, and we don't get much. Those who are bent on positioning blame on public schools are usually looking in the wrong spots. Their blame game should target real causes, such as misdirected education specialist, dumbed-down curricula and lowered expectations of students, teachers who make excuses, students and parents who make excuses, political correctness, and the philosophy that unequal results are unacceptably unjust. Devalued memorization. Chapter 3. The Golden Age of Teaching Yourself Anything. Who can resist the romanticism of self-taught achievers? They didn't really need school. They did not need the system. They needed only their passion and their talent to propel themselves to magnificence. Bill Gates, college dropout turned billionaire techie and world saver, is the modern apotheosis of the autodidact. His predecessors include Abe Lincoln, Virginia Woolf, Leonardo da Vinci, and Charles Darwin. Paradoxically, almost no one is an autodidact in the purest sense, because while learning certainly doesn't require a school or organization, it does generally require the help and assistance of other individuals, gotten in the form of conversation, books, DVDs, CDs, and now the treasure trove of documents, pictures, video tutorials, academic apps, public books, and free courses that are available online. To endure in the knowledge economy, we must all become self-taught learners, whatever our formal training was or will be. All learning, even within the stuffiest education system, is most importantly bolstered by self-teaching. The dancer takes a lesson once a week, but will barely retain the teacher's suggestions or advance in any way without individual practice that incorporates careful self-assessment and adjustments. She may not technically be an autodidact, but she is a self-directed learner, to use the in vogue term. You can be a self-taught student if you are in graduate school or if you are 85 and want to use up chess. However, what does it take to go from being a scattered, light Googler of short-lived interest to a bona fide autodidact? There are some elements, but the real surprise is that more of us aren't embracing the current age of access to proficiency of any subject. However, that might not be so surprising. Most of us were taught to be passive learners, to just get through school. It is easy to be lazy. The rewards of being an autodidact, however, include igniting inner fires, making new connections to knowledge and abilities you already have, advancing in your career, meeting kindred spirits, and cultivating an overall enthusiasm for life and its riches. One good reason to dive head initially into self-initiated learning is that much of what you were taught is already obsolete. Knowledge workers have success not based upon what they know, but rather how they learn, writes James Marcus Bach in his books, Secrets of a Buccaneer Scholar. He quit school when he was 14 and, in the early days of home computing, taught himself enough to end up being a software tester for Apple. He's now an independent consultant. Bach's philosophy is rebellious yet inclusive. Intellectual buccaneering is about self-education, but schools are okay as well. I've learned in schools, and I have learned something from people who were trained in schools. I happily plunder knowledge any place I find it. I do not look for the destruction of schools. I'm out to dismantle something else. The popular belief that schooling is the only route to a great education, and that the best students are the ones who passively accept the education their schools offer. Blake Bowles, a Gen Xer who graduated from the University of California, Berkeley, granted, he did create his own major, is a self-directed learning supporter who leads academic trips for teens. In his book, The Art of Self-Directed Learning, he writes, "The difference between self-directed students and everybody else is as quickly as school or work stops serving their life goals, they don't stick around. They ditch the well-trodden course, bust out the map and compass, and cut cross-country to virgin territory. Self-directed learners take full responsibility for their educations, professions, and lives." The question of intelligence. One of the best and most widely promoted examples of online learning, one mostly for kids and teens, is Khan Academy, begun in 2006 by Salman Khan, a former hedge fund analyst with 4 degrees from MIT and Harvard. He set out to make several videos to tutor his cousin in math, an undertaking that blew up into a school without borders. Khan Academy's site says it has provided over 580 million lessons in dozens of academic subjects. Students have finished more than 3.8 billion exercises by means of the Academy, or around 4 million a day. In a 2012 interview with Psychology Today, Khan guessed that his site is a haven for precocious children who love to learn. But he also said he believes the site can grow the ranks of clever and inspired children, not just reach the people that lack enriching resources. Our vision for the future is that everyone will be able to learn at an individual's own pace, and it should be proficiency-based. In a world like that, I think that you're going to broaden the number of people who are precocious self-learners, and we can engage much more people because they're going to have a real chance to take ownership of their learning and not be tired or lost. Some years ago, Khan took his mission to reform education into a brick-and-mortar setting by founding the Khan Laboratory School in Mountain View, California, where children work at their own rate using online programs, including his, and also team up on group projects. There are no grade levels or homework. Self-directed proficiency is the primary focus. Standout autodidacts tend to have high IQs, says Jonathan Way, Ph.D., a researcher at Duke University who has studied talented youth extensively. A lot of research shows that smarter people are more likely to take part in self-directed learning. If smarter people really focus on a subject, they're going to advance faster. But across IQ levels, enthusiasm makes up for a lot. There are lazy, wise people. There is individual irregularity in each part of the circulation of intelligence. Bowles says that he's observed most self-directed learners as blessed with a hereditary predisposition for independent thought, pattern recognition, and creative problem-solving. They are, to put it simply, bright. But he promotes the importance of having a development mindset over intelligence, as does Khan Academy. Your learning style. You may think that you're the type of student who needs to hear a lecture on microbiology rather than read a book, or a person who couldn't possibly learn how to write a limerick. A strenuous analysis by Christian Jarrett, a cognitive scientist and the creator of the British Mental Society's Research Digest blog site, finds little proof for believing in learning styles. Although each of us is unique, he notes, normally the most reliable way for us to learn is based not on our individual choices, but on the nature of the material we're being taught. Newbies learn better from examples. More expert students benefit from solving issues and integrating activities, like drawing a diagram of a cell after reading about it, improves learning for just about everybody. There's much dispute over whether kids should simply follow their intellectual dispositions, be unschooled, or be pushed to learn core facts and concepts that demonstrate cultural literacy. Even Bill Gates says you can't program computer systems without basic knowledge, says Way. It's clear that a foundation is needed for building knowledge up and outside, and that natural interest in doing so is also vital. Simply put, both sides are right. Ironically, the Khan Academy has been slammed for promoting way too much rote learning, thought to be the province of institutional education, not of the self-educators who watch his videos. Khan challenges the notion. The videos are focused on conceptual understanding, and we do have workouts that I would call purposeful practice. Rote means just remembering the formulas. Deliberate practice is, look, we are going to have you solve a bunch of formulas, and solving them will help you enter the rhythm and reasoning. I actually believe that most of the time, if you have worked yourself enough, your brain starts to draw connections. Deliberate practice nudges you just past your existing level of efficiency, Bowles explains. It is evaluating exactly what you want to learn that day and pushing yourself till you master that little concept, which is challenging for you, but not too challenging. Self-directed students, like everybody else, tend to stay away from deliberate practice at first because it's hard, scary, and lengthy. But once you've tasted the fruit of its process, true mastery, then you know its value. What's holding you back? It's neither intelligence nor method that holds people back from achieving success as self-taught learners, says Bach. It's insecurity. Feelings of inadequacy stop interest, he says. In Bach's own field of competitive thinkers, he has learned that many people who have ambition have a terrible fear that although they're good, they're not satisfactory or smart enough. It's crippling. It connects back to the idea of cultivating a growth mindset. People with such a frame of mind do not worry about how smart they are. What matters is their openness to developing their abilities and skills. Having purpose or meaning behind your objectives can help you persevere. In his book, Bowles tells the story of a 16-year-old girl who was captivated by the idea of structure something, but a lot more thinking about getting self-reliance from her family. She apprenticed with a regional designer for 9 months. After that, she got the assistance of others and built herself a small house all her own. Deciding what is essential to you, being open, and conquering fears all help. You need not be a taskmaster to prosper as an autodidact. Bach is a procrastinator. Still, after years of evaluating his learning and work patterns, he concludes that he must follow his own rhythms and impulses and trust that he will produce great eventually. When he is distracted, at the very least, part of his brain might be processing the tasks he's actively keeping away from. I need to brood for long periods of time until I get my mental organization in place. Once, he spent an entire month putting things off on an important project. Working on a very different task helped him get into the right headspace. Structure and responsibility. Structure, along with external pressure and reinforcement, is critical for many would-be self-directed students who, if left to their own gadgets, will just turn on the television. Take learning in a foreign language, something many claim they want to do, and some need to do to prosper in business or go after other opportunities. In his book, How We Learn, journalist Benedict Carey explains that an informed English speaker knows 20,000 to 30,000 words and numerous idioms and expressions. Acquiring even half of those would take approximately 2 hours of practice a day for 5 years by one estimate. Can the typical person truly summon the wherewithal? Well, it is a function of our age that there's an app for that. Duolingo, an app that, as of 2015, had more than 100 million users, offers lessons in speaking, listening, and translation, and multiple-choice challenges for more than 20 languages. Nobody is going to push your phone in your hand and open the app for you, but structure is built into the program, and so is positive reinforcement. You can instantly see what you've answered correctly. If you miss an obstacle, the app tells you how to enhance. You can see how many days in a row you have spent learning a language, a tool to motivate you to not break the chain. And, in a nod to gamification, you lose hearts when you answer improperly. Having a practical rationale for learning a language by yourself helps, though. A 2012 Queens College and University of South Carolina study of Duolingo found that its effectiveness hinges on the inspiration of the individuals. Those studying for travel got the most, while people studying for personal interest the least. Buy the aircraft tickets beforehand and pin them above your desk. Learning in a vacuum. Our desire for real-world travel, regardless of the vastness of the virtual world, hints at the potential constraints of online learning. Take the case of massive online open courses, MOOCs. In 2013, countless people registered for individual MOOC guideline, but about 95% of them didn't complete their coursework, Bowles indicates, a dropout rate far higher than with face-to-face direction. We are filled with info, Bowles argues, but if we don't connect the dots of what we're learning to our current body of knowledge, we get lost in the sea of information and miss the aha moment of understanding. It's a disadvantage that can be conquered with a little human contact, though. Other people can offer context and link concepts. If you're focusing completely on computer skills like graphic design or programming, then yes, the web alone can take you really far, he writes. Otherwise, you'll still really need guides, if not teachers who charge cash. However, as with other debates about education, it need not be either or. Master graphic design online, then sign up for a conference to learn even more. Bach advises self-directed students to find like-minded souls and join forces. So much of my success comes from the large network of people I can draw upon to challenge my work, check it, and team up with me. If I didn't have that network, I would be a shadow of what I am. Way marvels if self-directed learning will remain a pattern in little corners, or if those at the top of each field who went to recognized institutions will ever take online e-credentials seriously and open up the gateways. It's the challenge that autodidacts still face. Without the branding of a school, how can they show their abilities? It's a compelling question. It need not be dealt with now for you to put down the remote and learn something new. Chapter 4. What are learning styles? You have most likely heard of them. You complete a survey to be told that you are a visual learner or an acoustic learner, a reflector or a pragmatist, a diverger or a converger. But exactly what are learning styles? They are, sadly, one of the great myths in learning theory. 3 principles underlie the principle of a knowing style. 1. People will state that they prefer to learn in a particular style. They may choose information to be presented visually or verbally, etc. That is their opinion based upon their experience. 2. Individuals show differences in how well they can notice the difference between different forms of information. For example, some people may be better at learning to notice the difference between pieces of visual info, although others may be better at learning to see the difference between sounds. There's some evidence that this is true, and that it might even be reflected in patterns of activity within the brain. The third component is the most important. 3. Teaching individuals in their preferred or prescribed learning style will lead to improved learning. There's no good proof that this is true. There are, according to a thorough review conducted by Frank Cofield and co-workers, at least 71 different learning style plans, each including multiple learning style types. They categorize learners into styles using an entire variety of different methods, but, according to a substantial analysis conducted by Paschler and co-workers in 2008, there are no good information supporting the use of any of the learning styles in education. Teaching visual students using visual approaches doesn't make any distinction to how well they learn. There is a relatively basic explanation for why this might be. The VARK learning styles stock is just one of the most well-known and classifies people into visual, V, oral, A, reading, writing, R, and kinesthetic, K, or a combination of those. Think of learning more about, anything. Playing the guitar, for instance. You can't do that without selecting it up and playing it, K. Listening to your efforts as you do, A. Reading guidelines about what to do, R. And taking a look at images of finger positions for chords and notes for the music, V. The meaning of what's being learned is so much more intricate than one or two of these four modalities. Applying VARK to learn something simpler isn't without issues. How do you use the fact that a person is supposedly an acoustic learner if they're learning to recognize road signs to pass their driving test? That is visual info, and definitely needs to be learned aesthetically, as it will have to be acknowledged aesthetically. When we begin to unpick it, the really idea of learning styles does not have basic validity. Both the Cofield and Paschler documents are unquestionable about this, and are clear that learning styles should not be used. It is relatively simple to check for the effectiveness of learning styles. One easy way would be to take two groups of people with different learning styles, say one group of visual students and one group of kinesthetic students, and you teach all of them using the preferred learning style of just one of the groups. Then you evaluate them to see how well they did, or if both of the previously mentioned groups were taught using visual approaches, then the visual learners should do better on the test than the kinesthetic learners. Unfortunately, the majority of these studies which support the application of learning styles lack this basic rigor, and proof of this type is lacking. So, learning styles have been tested many times, and no strenuous proof has yet been found to support their usage, and we can deconstruct them to show that they are not truly a legitimate way of classifying students. It matters that learning styles are so popular, and for some reasons. To me, the most essential is that there are a lot of things that do work in education. Appropriate training of instructors, including evaluation by their peers, is one. Another is practice test for students. John Hattie has done a massive amount of work to identify what works in education, and his findings are summarized here. This work isn't without its own debate, but that's for another day. The usage of learning styles diverts time and other resources from techniques that have been revealed to work. There are other issues. Pigeonholing learners into one style may label or burden them. It may prevent them from learning about things which do not appear to fit their learning style, and wrongly produce the impression that it is going to be harder for them when they need to. The persistence of learning styles also weakens confidence in education research, which, as I have written formerly, already has something of an image problem. Why are learning styles so popular, despite many people repeatedly pointing out these problems? Perhaps the most engaging reason is that, basically, people are different. We do plainly state choices for the method which we are taught, and have hundreds of other individual preferences and views besides. Thus, the really idea of learning styles is appealing at a really standard level. It makes instinctive sense that there are ways to customize teaching to maximize our individual differences and preferences, and that this would make our education more effective. Yet, we just do not seem to have found out how to do this well. Yet. Do learning styles determine grades? A current trending education subject is the idea that learning styles is a neuroscience myth. Like other myths, we only use 10% of our brain, and that drinking less than 6 to 8 glasses of water a day will cause the brain to diminish. What are learning styles? Learning styles are an individual's favored method to organizing and representing information. While there are a variety of learning styles models, the most common model is a two-dimensional one with verbal-visual measurements. The verbal learning style suggests that an individual prefers to represent info verbally, while the visual learning style means that the individual prefers to create psychological images. There's also a holist analytic style dimension, which divides students into whether they choose to organize info into wholes or parts. How did this myth arise? The idea of learning styles based upon the idea that we use different parts of the brain to process verbal and visual info. So the assumption is that students learn in a different way based on which part of their brains work better. What's the issue with the idea of learning styles? 1. We are not that good of determining our learning styles. Research shows that we are actually extremely poor in determining how we learn. For example, an individual may think they're visual learners when in fact they have verbal strengths. 2. Learning styles do not anticipate grades. I wanted to check out the role of learning styles in grades, so I recruited a group of high schoolers and gave them a digital test of learning style to find out their favorite approach of learning. I then looked at their efficiency in standardized tests of English, mathematics, and science. According to the learning style method, holists verbalizers will perform least expensive in math. I also tested the students' working memory, the ability to process and remember verbal and visual info. Results? The pattern was the same for all disciplines. Students with high working memory performed best in English, math, and science, no matter their learning style. Students who reported being visual learners still did very well in verbal-based tests, and vice versa. This means that while a student might have a preferred technique of learning, it is their working memory and not whether they are visual or verbal students that determines their grades. Do learning styles matter for learning? The learning styles theory claims that individuals learn best in different ways. A popular framework for learning styles is one that separates verbalizers from visualizers and holistic thinkers from analytical ones. Verbalizers, people who choose language-based learning. Visualizers, people who prefer learning with images. Analytical, people who choose to focus on the details when learning. Holistic, people who choose to look at the big picture when learning. To see how a student's favored learning style affects them in the class, imagine that you are back in your high school science class. The topic for today, glaciers and their development. The instructor presents a slideshow of the various phases of glacier development, using nothing but pictures of Yosemite National Forest. You get the fundamentals of glacier formation immediately because you respond best to info that is shown with images. Having said that, your schoolmate Brandon would prefer to see slides containing text that clarified the glacier development process, so he has to work much harder to comprehend the material. And another classmate, Alice, has trouble grasping the concept just because the teacher focused solely on the nitty-gritty specifics about the different stages of glacier development without offering any info about the big picture. The concept of learning styles would argue that you would ace a test given after this lesson, while Brandon and Alice would not fare so well. An advocate of the learning style structure would claim that depending on the type of learner that you are going to master one subject, but not necessarily in another. This is an example. Analytical thinkers tend to do better in school simply because their more detailed outlook allows them to come rapidly to the heart of any problem. Verbalizers also do well because teaching is shown using written information rather than pictures, so they can get the most from it. However, this theory may be missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. I performed a study with a group of high school students to look at working memory, learning styles, and scholastic results. The high school students needed to take standardized tests that assessed their knowledge in a variety of subjects like English, mathematics, science, history, and geography. When I gave these high school students a well-known learning styles questionnaire, and then tested their working memory using a standardized test battery, the results were unexpected. Students with good working memory stood out at all subjects, regardless of their learning style preference. The visualizers did just as well as the verbalizers in all subjects, and holistic thinkers scored just as highly as analytical ones. While this may appear perplexing in the framework of the learning style structure, here is one explanation for the findings. Students who have good working memory are able to adapt their learning style to different learning situations, regardless if information is presented with images, text, details, or the huge picture. Even though they may have a certain preference for acquiring knowledge, they won't be kept back if information isn't presented in their favored learning style. Chapter 5. Knowing a child's learning style improves memory skills. Memory and learning go hand in hand. Although the two terms are not synonymous, they're highly interrelated. In order to remember, an individual's brain must first learn, encode, the info they will later remember, retrieval. When it comes to learning issues, whether a child has ADHD, a finding out handicap, anxiety, or some other psychological difficulty, parents' most typical question to me is, how can we enhance his or her memory? Memory is highly impacted by learning style. Once a person's learning style is understood and accommodated for, memory will improve. When people comprehend their learning style, they can adapt how they learn to most effectively use their brains, including and improving their memory ability. Here are ways to determine an individual's special learning style. 1. Mental or neuropsychological testing offers formal insight into the brain through a set of standardized tasks that are administered and scored according to testing requirements. The results are compared to normative data, offers a special profile of a person's strengths and weakness in learning style contrasted with exact same age peers. Basically, the test results offer a breeze shot into an individual's brain functioning as it associates with their behavior and learning style. 2. The informal or non-standardized way of identifying learning style is by acknowledging what type of learning is simple and instinctual, contrasted with what type is challenging for an individual. This means recognizing what comes quickly and naturally and what does not. When it comes to enhancing memory, knowledge of learning style is important, and here are some fundamental guidelines. 1. Acoustic students are people that are best at listening and learning. These are the children who really love to listen to and comprehend challenging stories, but aren't able to comprehend and for that reason recall at the same level if they read the information from a book. They remember what they hear, especially in context. They pick up languages easily simply because of the acoustic element and their ability to copy and remember the sounds of what they hear. Acoustic students hear the info, and when it is time to remember it, and they recite an acoustic script in their head as part of remembering it. 2. Visual learners benefit from seeing what they really need to learn and remember. They do a lot better by watching a visual of info or reading info. They also tend to be inclined to issue solve with their hands. They like to see and manipulate visual info, thus learning visual problem-solving techniques that can be recalled and used in other circumstances where visual learning is needed. Visual students choose to see the info to be remembered and can develop a visual file in their brain to obtain this information when needed. 3. Most people with attention and executive functioning weak points are challenged by existing with different types of learning simultaneously. For instance, if they are introduced to a new person, they might not remember their name because they are hearing the name while visually processing their face. Those two inputs contend in a currently overloaded brain, causing lapse of memory of the name. Aside from that, ADHD people tended not to remember rote facts, such as names of unfamiliar people, simply because they depend on contextual hints to help them make the information more meaningful and remarkable. 4. Most people with executive functioning and/or learning impairments, not with learning choices like auditory and visual learning preferences as defined above, but actual impairments, often need repeating of information through a range of methods, visual, acoustic, tactical, sensory, as part of the encoding and retrieval process needed for memory. Many people don't have learning disabilities or executive functioning weaknesses, and yet memory remains a difficulty. Some don't have a preferred learning style. However, many people have some irregularity with strengths and weak points in their learning profile. The basic method of knowing and using one's preferred learning style to reinforce memory is not practiced regularly today, and yet it should be. Given the rate and the pace of life today, it behooves people to know their learning style and the learning styles of those around them with whom they rely on and communicate with consistently. People communicate most effectively when information is presented in a way that is consistent with a person's learning style. Most miscommunications take place in relationships, both parent-child and parent-parent, because of misunderstanding of one another's learned styles and abilities, all of which impact memory. Chapter 6. More studying makes easy tests. A detailed but brief and understandable paper sums up 5 tested methods that make it simpler for students to keep their knowledge in the long run. The authors reason that these methods should be incorporated by students and instructors. 1. Spacing. For example, expanding the studying. 2. Interleaving. For example, mixing up different types of problems. 3. Testing. 4. Elaborative interrogation. For example, asking yourself why. And 5. Self-explanation. For example, asking yourself, did I know this? In one research study, high school students were told to learn French and were consequently tested. Half of the students were given 30 minutes to learn all of the vocabulary words, while the other half studied the words on 3 consecutive days for 10 minutes each. Test results revealed that, although the students who studied for 30 minutes straight performed better on a test right after studying, the students who expanded their study sessions, spacing, performed better a week in the future, a pop quiz. Likewise, in another research study, 4th grade students who practiced doing different kinds of mathematics problems simultaneously, interleaved practice, performed far better in the long run than the ones that practiced a piece of the same type of math problem and then moved on to another chunk of the exact same kind of math problem, and so on, blocked practice. To examine the impacts of testing on memory, Roediger and Karpik compared the long-lasting recall of 3 groups of students who were told to read a passage. One group simply read the passage 4 times. Another group read it 3 times and took a test. A third group read the passage only once and then took 3 tests. As expected, the ones who read the most did the best on an assessment given right afterwards. For the assessment, they had to document everything they could remember from the reading. Though, 1 week later, the group who took the most tests but studied only once recalled the most information from the reading. Studies also back up the advantages of asking yourself questions as you read. In one experiment, biology students were told to read a section in the textbook. One group was periodically asked questions involving why the facts held true. In the other group, students simply read the section twice. Based upon a later true or incorrect quiz on facts, students who were triggered to answer why, elaborative interrogation, performed better than the ones that only read the text. On a similar note, in an earlier study, 2 groups of high school students were told to study a math theorem. One group had to consider loud and monitor their own learning by asking themselves questions about their learning experience as they read the text. In other words, did I know this? The other group were simply told to consider loud. The next day, all students took a test. Results showed that the students who took part in self-monitored learning, self-explanation, were better able to use their skills to novel types of mathematics problems. The 5 techniques that the authors talk about appear hard to apply initially, just because students feel like they are not learning as quickly. Undoubtedly, studying properly requires time. After all, who wants to pause every 5 minutes while reading a thick book and need to think to themselves, why is this right? Did I know this? But in the long term, the proof suggests that this time is well spent. Moreover, these tricks are relatively basic and affordable, unlike some other reforms. The Los Angeles United School District, for example, recently chose to allocate $1 billion to buying 6,000 iPads for students. The bond used to pay for those iPads will likely be on the books for decades, even though an iPad's life expectancy is most likely no more than 5 years. Moreover, there's very little data to indicate that iPads actually help students find out more successfully. The methods we talked about, on the other hand, are backed up by solid proof. They can also be carried out at minimal cost. Students can easily try to turn some of these methods into habits, and instructors can attempt to reorganize their lesson strategies. Based upon the research, here are some suitable studying tricks. Research study a little bit of each subject every day. Space it out. Don't just try to memorize it. Practice different kinds of issues in a jumbled order, so you're not really doing the same kind of issue all in one go. Test yourself and take as many practice tests as are available. Practice questions help too. While studying, ask yourself, why is this true? How did it happen? Then try to answer those questions. Also ask, did I know this information already? Does it make sense to me? Is this something new? To do the above, you can make flashcards. Study some flashcards for each subject every day and randomize the order, and so on. You can also make several question flashcards. That is, why was the previous fact considerable? Or, how does this relate to what I know? And toss them into the stack to regularly remind yourself to take part in much deeper thoughts about the ideas. Many of the students most likely intuitively know that they shouldn't just pack. However, studying in advance takes a lot of self-monitoring and inspiration. Educators, however, can sneakily integrate these evidence-based studying techniques in their curriculum. For instance, instructors can teach some of each idea every day to spread the lesson out. They can also give more quizzes and tests, or timely students with a simple, "Why does that make a lot of sense?" once in a while. These tricks can help students better retain important ideas, even if students think these study abilities appear harder in the beginning. Chapter 7. Cumulative Exams. It's that time of year again. Last tests. Are you taking or giving a cumulative last exam? From a cognitive psychologist's perspective, you should be. Cumulative finals might not be fun, but they can considerably enhance long-lasting learning. The spacing impact. Cumulative examinations make the most of the spacing effect. If you have already studied something, studying it again after a hold-up can produce a huge amount of learning. Studying the exact same information without letting time pass in between produces much less learning. A cumulative test means that in December you are going to have to restudy whatever you learned back in September. Since that includes spacing, you're going to learn a lot from doing it. Spaced learning is specifically crucial for long-lasting learning. If you want to remember something for the short term, maybe just for your exam in some days, spaced learning will help some. If you want to learn something for life, spaced learning is absolutely crucial. Research shows that the longer you want to remember something, the more you should space your learning. Repeating. When researchers study spaced learning, they hold the number of times you will study constant. But a cumulative examination actually makes you spend additional time studying material from earlier in the year. Studying more undoubtedly helps, and some studies show that it specifically helps in the long term, specifically if the studying includes self-testing. Therefore, cumulative exams offer the advantages spaced repetitions and more repetitions. Expectations. Knowing there will be a cumulative final most likely alters the way the majority of people study, for the better. However, what if students were not permitted to study differently? Here's a research study that suggests that simply telling students that there will be a cumulative last exam might enhance their learning. The data were collected in a circumstance that was undoubtedly far from a very real classroom experience. However, the findings suggest that how we process and store knowledge depends on how long we expect to really need to know it. The impact would probably have been amplified if the experimenters had allowed their subjects to change their conduct based on their expectations, which is what happens in real life. Don't let your intuition fool you. We all know that studying more is good, right? Well, yes. However, it turns out that people often ignore the value of repeated studying. There appears to be at least 3 reasons for this misperception. First, people do not recognize the benefits of spacing. They usually think it has negative results. Second, people are prejudiced to think their memories will not change much in the future, so they ignore the benefits of future studying. And third, people think that once they can remember something, they know it. And perhaps they do in the short term, but simply because you can recall it now, that does not mean you won't have forgotten it later. Therefore, people think studying something they know is a waste of time, when in reality, studying it more, or actually screening themselves on it, can have massive long-lasting value. Improving education. In an ideal world, Bio 101 students would have to take a cumulative Bio 101 examination a year after finishing the course. There'd be 2 benefits of doing so. The first is that even percentages of spaced research study can produce lasting learning. Second, if teachers tailored their teaching towards longer-term learning, they might do things in a different way, in ways which would make education more efficient. This has been Accelerated Learning, Understanding How to Memorize and Change Your Learning Style by Corey Hansen, narrated by Mark Milroy.